In Star Wars, the planets are not scenery. Most of them have been used by someone, and a few were used in ways the galaxy chose to forget. Some are buried weapons, others are wounds being kept open on purpose, and a handful are crime scenes nobody ever investigated. 6 worlds carry that weight more clearly than any others. The first one nearly broke the most powerful Jedi Master alive. The red dust of Korriban has been settling over the bones of the fallen for longer than most civilizations have existed. Before anyone built the first tomb, before anyone carved the first name into stone, this planet was already wrong. Barren canyon walls stripped of nearly all life, a sky the light never quite breaks through, and silence where there should be wind. The landscape does not just look empty, it looks used. To understand why Yoda's visit nearly broke him, you have to understand what was already in the ground when he landed. The Force clings to places where suffering and ritual have built up over long stretches of time. The cave on Dagobah, where Luke Skywalker confronted his own doubts, is one small example. A place where dark-side energy concentrated to an unusual degree. Most places like that are contained to a single cave or chamber. Korban is not a single dark spot, it is the whole planet. Even the earliest legend sources, which carry most of this history, only scratch the surface of what was building here. Much of the planet's earliest history comes from those legends accounts. Long before any civilization claimed this world, Korban was already radiating dark-side energy strong enough to register from the far side of the galaxy. Ancient empires that existed long before the Sith recognized that power and marked the planet as significant. Those empires eventually collapsed. Korban kept pulling, and yet, the Dark Lords did not create the corruption rooted in this world. They inherited it. The species that evolved here, a red-skinned people known simply as the Sith, were Force-sensitive from the beginning, and their culture, shaped by centuries of isolation on a world already leaning toward the shadow of the Force, was built around dark-side traditions from the start. They practiced alchemy and blood sacrifice, and their burial sites were not cultural decoration, but structures built to serve a specific function. The tombs they carved were sealed chambers designed to store dark-side energy, trap the essence of the departed inside the walls, and channel the life force of sacrificed servants into the stone itself. Every tomb worked like a battery, a contained system that built up dark-side power and released it slowly into the surrounding landscape over centuries. The more powerful the individual laid to rest inside, the more concentrated the energy stored within the walls, and they never stopped building them. Unlike a scar left by a single battle, the weight pressing down on Korban does not fade at any point in its recorded history. It compounds, growing heavier with every tomb added to the landscape. Each generation inherited a world more saturated than the one before, and left it heavier still. The planet cycled through periods of habitation and abandonment, but even when its surface lay empty for centuries, the tombs kept working. The energy stored in the walls did not need living caretakers. It sustained itself, drawing from the suffering sealed inside, and releasing it slowly into the surrounding ground. By the time outside forces arrived, the species had been layering this power into the rock for millennia. The world was loaded beyond anything they fully understood. Even then, the people who would push Korriban past the breaking point had already lost a war, and they were already looking for somewhere to land. Chapter 2: The Exiled Jedi. The struggle that produced the Sith tradition did not begin in Korriban. It began inside the Jedi Order. The Legends timeline carries the fullest account of what happened next. A faction of Jedi had turned toward the dark side, practicing forms of alchemy and force manipulation the Order had long forbidden. After a prolonged conflict later called the 100-Year Darkness, the Order defeated them. The question of what came next would define the galaxy for longer than anyone alive at the time could have imagined. The victors faced a choice that would echo through galactic history longer than almost any other single decision. They could carry out final judgment on the defeated Darksiders. They could imprison them with no end in sight, or they could exile them, sending them beyond Republic space and letting distance do what Force of Arms had not finished. The Jedi chose exile. Their philosophy demanded compassion, and a mass execution was incompatible with what the Order believed itself to stand for. The defeated faction, led by a man named Ajunta Pall, was stripped of weapons and cast into uncharted space, and what they found would reshape the galaxy for 25,000 years. They found Korriban, and what followed was not simply a conquest, but a fusion, and the thing it produced was more formidable than either side could have created alone. The Sith tradition was born from that exchange. Ajunta Pall and his followers arrived on a world inhabited by Force-sensitive people who had been practicing dark-side traditions longer than the Jedi Order had existed. The exiles conquered them by force, but the deeper exchange ran in both directions. The exiles brought advanced knowledge of the Force, techniques, and depth of understanding the native species had never developed. In return, the original inhabitants offered centuries of refined burial craft, deep ritual knowledge rooted in their specific environment, and a working relationship with a planet that was itself a reservoir of dark-side power. Together, on a world already saturated with that energy, they built something the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization where the Force itself was engineered into the landscape. The consequences would outlast every person involved by millennia. The Jedi Order that made exile possible would spend the rest of its existence dealing with what that mercy produced. The Valley of the Dark Lords began to take shape during this period, carved through the landscape as a deep corridor lined with tomb entrances and flanked by towering statues of the lords who rested inside. With every generation, the valley grew larger and heavier. Each new lord demanded a burial grander than the last, and the corridor stretched deeper into the canyon with every addition. What had started as a burial ground was becoming something else entirely, a seat of authority that outlasted every individual who contributed to it. Even so, the man who started it all could not escape what his creation became. Ajunta Pall, the first Dark Lord, was eventually entombed in the same stone that he had helped shape. The Legends novel Revan reveals that when visitors found his tomb millennia later, the presence waiting inside was not triumphant. It was full of regret, one of the only Dark Lords in the entire historical record to express anything resembling remorse from beyond the grave. The man who had started everything wished he could take it back. The valley did not care. It fed on the regret the same way it fed on any other suffering sealed into its walls. The tradition Pall founded would outlast him by millennia, and the valley it filled would grow into the most feared corridor in the galaxy, the same corridor Yoda would one day walk alone. Chapter 3: Valley of Lords. As the centuries passed, the Valley of the Dark Lords grew into something no other place in the galaxy could match. Red rock and sand stretched between the monuments, and the air itself felt heavier the deeper anyone walked. The valley worked like a resonance chamber, the same way a cathedral amplifies sound by shaping how waves interact in a shared space. Each burial strengthened the next, and the combined effect of dozens of tombs radiating at once produced a surrounding weight far more powerful than any single burial could generate on its own. With every new tomb added to the system, the chamber grew louder. The air itself carried the charge. The lords did not build their tombs as memorials. They built them as instruments. They filled burial chambers with weapons, encrypted knowledge, ritual constructs, and traps designed to kill. Through ceremonies refined over generations, they sealed their essences into the tomb walls, preserving their awareness long after death. The more lethal a tomb, the more famous its occupant became. The more famous the occupant, the more ambitious seekers came to attempt the challenges within. Anyone who entered the valley was tested. Anyone who tested was changed. No one walked through the valley the same person they were when they walked in. In death, the lords of the valley became a governing body of the departed, still conducting examinations and still passing judgments centuries after their time had ended. Among the most discussed was Tulak Horde, whose combined mastery of lightsaber combat and raw force power made his reputation one of the most enduring in the history of the Ancient Order. Accounts describing ending duels before they truly began, moving with a speed and precision that left opponents certain the outcome was already decided. His command of the Force was no less direct, draining the will from entire groups before a blade was ever drawn. He sealed the essence of his own servant inside his tomb, so the man's torment would continue as a permanent offering long after both of them were gone. Nagasato's ambitions reached far enough to spark a full-scale offensive against the Republic, and his burial chamber contained objects so volatile that trained practitioners did not enter it casually even centuries later. Still, no figure showed how the valley truly worked more clearly than Mark Aragnos. He ruled for a century, and when he fell, his presence appeared at the entrance to his tomb to judge which of his rivals deserved to succeed him. Even in death, Ragnos was still setting the terms. Two lords, Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, stood before that apparition and competed for the title. The contest was not resolved cleanly. Their rivalry tore the Empire apart and drove Sato to launch a campaign against the Republic, believing that conquest would settle the question of power Ragnos had left open. The Republic crushed that offensive and then struck back with a retaliation campaign that hit the ancient worlds from orbit, scattered populations, and targeted the temples the Order had built over generations. One fallen lord had judged two living ones. Two living ones had torn an empire apart. Apparitions rising from burial chambers to confront the living, visions designed to test and manipulate, all of it still running when Yoda walked into the valley millennia later. The dead were still setting the galaxy on fire from inside their tombs. Other dark side worlds exist, but none of them work the way Korriban does. As shown in Rebels, Malachor is a shattered world, its surface littered with the remains of warriors frozen in the moment of their final stand. The power there is real and intense, but it has a fixed character sealed in place by a single devastating event. Malachor stopped developing the instant that event ended. Every other dark side world in the galaxy shares some version of the same limitation, power that is either frozen in place, tied to a single culture, or dependent on infrastructure that someone could locate and dismantle. Korban does not stay in one place. It reaches out, draws force-sensitive people from vast distances, and either breaks them or sends them back into the galaxy carrying its influence. It does not wait for visitors, it calls to them, and the system that built this engine had been refining itself for longer than most galactic governments had existed. Chapter 4: The Sith Machine. A young man arrived in Korriban with nothing but ability and anger. No title, no lineage, no recognized claim to anything. By the time he left, he had become the single most important figure in the history of the Ancient Order, the architect of a 1,000-year plan that ended with the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Galactic Empire. The Legends novel Path of Destruction tells his story. His name was Bane, and what happened to him is the clearest record of what Korriban's system actually does to the people who walk into it. The first layer of that process is the planet functioning as political ground. Every major dark-side regime in galactic history returned to Korriban, not out of tradition for its own sake, but because controlling the planet sent a signal with real consequences in a galaxy where the Force is physically felt. A lord who held Korriban gained direct access to a planetary well of dark-side energy that rivals could sense from an entire region away. Empires that control this world projected an authority that any regime based elsewhere simply could not match, because the authority was not symbolic alone, it was something people could feel. The second layer is the Academy, and this is where Bane's story cuts deepest. Academies operated on Korriban across multiple distinct eras, and each reflected the civilization that built it. During the Brotherhood of Darkness, the era Bane lived through and then dismantled, the Academy ran under a philosophy Bane came to regard as deeply flawed, one that rewarded cooperation and collective strength rather than individual power. What united every version of the Academy in every era was its core function. It was a filter. Path of Destruction shows students competing against each other in direct combat and being sent into ancient tombs on assignments expected to kill a significant number of them. The planet's constant dark-side pressure bore down on students without relief and without protection. Instructors did not shield them, they evaluated them. The Fallen were not a failure of the design, they were proof it was working. Bane survived, but the planet did far more than test him. His direct encounters with the tombs reshaped him from the ground up. He discovered a holocron that challenged his entire understanding of how the dark side should be practiced, and through it came to see the Brotherhood not as a legitimate order, but as a corruption of everything the ancient lords had built. Path of Destruction shows his time on Korriban not as training but as excavation, the planet stripping away everything in him that was not essential until what remained was harder and sharper than anything that had walked in. By the time he left, Bane was no longer just a formidable man. He carried the authority to dismantle the existing order and replace it with the rule of two. That structure would outlast him by 1,000 years and end with the fall of the Jedi themselves. But none of these parts would matter on their own, and Bane was not the exception. He was proof that the system worked. Together, they create a feedback loop that makes everything else permanent. Force-sensitive people are drawn to the planet from vast distances, some pulled by instinct, others seeking it deliberately. Once on the surface, the effects build. Creeping unease sharpens into dread. Unwanted thoughts arrive that feel less like imagination and more like memory. Visions pull from the specific fears of whoever's standing in the canyon. Those who fall on the planet add more suffering and power to the ground beneath them. Those who survive leave more deeply immersed in the dark side and carry the planet's influence back into the wider galaxy, becoming, knowingly or not, its next recruiters. The cycle has no natural endpoint. It is self-sustaining. By the time Yoda set foot on the surface, this loop had been running uninterrupted for longer than the Republic had existed. The reach of the system extended far beyond the valley itself, and the proof stretches back long before Bane's time. Frieda Nad sought out the tombs of Korban, and as told in the Tales of the Jedi comics, found the spirit of the ancient Lord Nagasato waiting inside. He absorbed the teachings of the dark side at their source, and then carried that influence to the distant world of Onderon, where he established his own dark side legacy that persisted for centuries. Korban did not just hold its power, it exported it. Bane walked into this engine as raw material. He walked out as the most formidable practitioner alive. And when the planet needed to make its most powerful argument against Yoda, the last Jedi who would ever enter the valley, it was Bane's image it chose to send. Korriban had been forging people like Bane for longer than recorded history could fully account for. And for all that time, the galaxy had the power to stop it. Chapter 5. Why it survived. The reason Korriban survived is more unsettling than anything sealed inside its tombs. The galaxy had the power to act. It had the knowledge. It had the motivation, and at several points in history, it tried. And yet, the system kept running. Not because the Dark Lords were unbeatable, but because every institution that tried to stop it made choices that felt reasonable in the moment, and together guaranteed nothing would ever be finished. Much of the history in this chapter comes from legend sources, where the Republic's repeated failures to deal with Korriban are most fully recorded. The earliest mistake began before Korriban even became a Sith world. The Jedi Order's decision to exile the defeated Darksiders after the 100-Year Darkness was made in genuine good faith. Exile was the compassionate middle ground between execution and indefinite imprisonment. The exiles found Korriban, they founded the Sith tradition. 25,000 years of recurrent conflict trace a direct line back to that single decision. More critically, the choice set an example the galaxy would repeat after every major defeat that followed. Survivors were allowed to scatter rather than being tracked to the end. The most devastating example of what happens when survivors are allowed to scatter is the figure known in legends as Vitiate. After the Republic crushed the Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate gathered the remaining lords on a world called Nathema. He drew life force from every one of them and from every other living thing on the planet through a ritual so complete it stripped Nathema of the Force entirely. What had been a living world became a silent, empty shell, a planet with no Force presence at all. As if the energy itself had been ripped out of the ground, Vitiate walked away effectively immortal, disappeared into the unknown regions, and spent over 1,000 years rebuilding in secret before emerging with a fully restored empire. He had trained in Korriban, he had walked the valley and stood in the tombs of the ancient lords. The conviction that power justified everything, that the end of life was a problem to be solved rather than accepted, those were the lessons the planet had been teaching since before he was born. Corban did not simply shape him, it made him possible. When the Republic tried force instead of patience, the result was no better. The retaliation campaign after that same war was the most aggressive attempt any government ever made to end the threat for good. Sith worlds were struck from orbit, populations were scattered, and temples were deliberately targeted in what was meant as the complete destruction of an entire civilization. And yet, it failed in the one place that actually mattered. Surface structures could be destroyed, physical monuments could be shattered, but the dark side energy stored inside the tombs, the sealed essences, the weapons, the power woven into the rock over millennia, all of it survived the assault untouched. The Republic had leveled every visible sign of a threat while leaving the actual source intact. And now, no one was watching it. The campaign did not destroy the threat, it pushed it deeper underground, leaving it to grow quietly for the next civilization ambitious enough to return. Centuries after the bombardment, a small expedition returned to the Valley of the Dark Lords. They expected ruins. What they found were tombs still active, defenses untouched, the dark side still radiating from the canyon walls as if the war had never happened. The dark side energy stored in the burial chambers had not needed the surface structures to survive. It had been woven into the rock itself, and it was still building. The Republic had declared victory over a world that had not even noticed the attack. Quietly, the most damaging response of all had already been underway for centuries. The Jedi Order did not try to destroy Korriban or reclaim it. They avoided it. Rather than treating the planet as a threat requiring ongoing attention, the Order treated it as something spiritually contaminating, a place where serious study felt forbidden. The Clone Wars shows that when Yoda announced his intention to travel to Korriban, the Council's reaction was not a strategic concern. It was an alarm rooted in legend and institutional reluctance. Every time a Jedi Master warned an apprentice about the dangers of the ancient home world, anyone already drawn towards the dark side heard confirmation that the power was real. The Order's avoidance became a standing invitation, broadcast to everyone the shadow had already reached. And it meant that when Yoda finally decided to go, he went without any institutional knowledge of what he was actually walking into. No Jedi had studied the planet in generations. No protocols existed. He was walking in blind, armed with nothing except the Force and 800 years of training. Compassion that created the enemy. Force that missed the target. Avoidance that advertised the threat. 3 responses across thousands of years, and each decision made sense on its own terms. Together, they guaranteed the system would never stop. At the very end, when the Jedi Order was already in its final years without knowing it, one Jedi finally went to see for himself. Chapter 6: Yoda's Trial. Of all the beings who ever set foot on that world, only one went there not to gain power, but to prove he could survive without wanting it. In the final season of the Clone Wars, Yoda began hearing the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Master who had fallen on Naboo more than a decade earlier. Qui-Gon had achieved something the Jedi Order had believed lost for centuries, a form of awareness preserved after death, a continuing connection to the living Force. The voice guided Yoda to the priestesses, mysterious beings who existed at a boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, and who held a secret to life after death. They set Yoda on a series of trials, each one testing a different dimension of what he was and what he carried. One trial forced him to face a shadow inside himself, the parts of his own nature he had spent centuries keeping in check. His purpose through all of it was to preserve the Jedi through whatever lay ahead. The last and deepest trial required him to travel to the one place the Jedi Council had spent generations refusing to go: Korriban. He went knowing exactly what it was. From the moment he entered the atmosphere, the dark side was already pressing against him. It did not wait for him to approach the tombs or descend into the valley. On the surface, the wait was immediate. The canyon walls of the valley rose around him, lined with the same tombs that had been collecting power since before the Republic existed. Every burial chamber he passed still held the sealed essence of the Lord within, and every one of them registered his presence. The Force pressing on him, shown across that final Clone Wars arc, was not passive but directed, searching for entry points, finding the places where even the most disciplined mind carries something unresolved, and leaning on them. The planet showed him a vision of the Clone Wars resolved in a single moment, a false reality where the conflict ended. The Jedi survived, and everything he had been carrying simply stopped hurting. The temple on Coruscant was intact. The younglings were safe. The war had never reached the places it should not have been allowed to reach. It offered him the thing any exhausted leader would want the most, the lie that the struggle was already over. After 800 years of service and 3 years of watching the Order bleed out across a conflict he could not win, that vision was designed to find exactly where Yoda was most tired. He saw through it. Then the planet sent something older against him. Among the things that confronted Yoda was an apparition of Bane, the Lord whose time on Korriban had given him the authority to reshape the entire Order and establish the rule of two. Korban selected the most potent symbol it had ever produced. Bane was the end product of everything this world had ever made. The man it had shaped and released into the galaxy to change it forever. His image was the planet's most powerful argument, a demonstration that its methods worked. Yoda recognized it for what it was and held his ground. What followed carried more weight than anything that came before it. In the final episode of that arc, Sidious himself reached through the Force to confront Yoda directly. The Dark Lord, who had spent decades orchestrating the fall of the Republic from within, now turned his full attention to the one Jedi who would come closest to sensing his presence. Working through deception and temptation, he forced a choice where every option led to the betrayal of something Yoda held sacred: save one life and condemn another. Act and cause harm, or refuse to act and allow it. And he did not come alone. Every tomb in the valley discharged at once against Yoda. The interconnected burial chambers, the sealed remnants, the dark side energy built into rock over generations of ritual and sacrifice, all of it focused on a single point. In that moment, the full weight of 25,000 years of accumulated power pressed against 800 years of conviction, and Sidious was betting it would be enough. Yoda survived by refusing the terms entirely. He did not choose between the options. He rejected the premise that those were the only choices available. In doing so, he proved the one thing Korriban had never been able to account for in its entire history: someone who could stand inside the full weight of its shadow and simply choose not to be moved by it. The planet had broken students, consumed lords, and buried civilizations. It could not break him. Not because he was stronger, but because he wanted nothing from it. And then, he left. He carried what he had learned and told no one. He proposed no follow-up action. He convened no strategic review. Whatever understanding he took from Korriban stayed inside him and went no further into the institution he led. When he returned, the Jedi Order's relationship with the planet was exactly what it had been before he arrived. There was no way to turn one person's understanding into a shared response, and the Order had spent too long not building that kind of process. No one else would learn what he had learned. Within months, the Order would fall. The Clone Wars would end not with the victory Yoda had spent 3 years trying to secure, but with the destruction of almost everything the Jedi had built across generations. The journey that had taken Yoda through the priestesses and through Korriban, the understanding of how to preserve consciousness beyond death, would prove to be among the last things of real value the Old Order produced. Korriban had been the final proving ground, and Yoda had walked out carrying a knowledge that the coming destruction could not erase. Yoda's journey to Korriban was not a turning point, it was a farewell. The deepest terror of Korriban is not the power stored in its tombs or the remnants that still inhabit them. It is the fact that the planet survived, not because of some unstoppable force, but because of ordinary choices made by well-meaning people operating under understandable limits. The Republic commanders who declared victory and went home were not fools. The Jedi who looked away were not cowards. No single person failed. The response failed, and it kept failing so quietly that no one noticed it had become permanent. Just another part of how the galaxy worked. That is the story Korriban tells about the galaxy that created it. Not a story about the power of the dark side, but a story about the cost of choosing comfort over completion, generation after generation, until no single generation could undo what all the ones before it had allowed. Korriban was loaded with dark side power by the people who lived on it. The next world was loaded by the people who destroyed it. Before the dunes, Tatooine looked nothing like a wasteland, and the empire that left it that way is one history barely remembers. Everyone remembers the planet for its dunes, but the sand is not what makes Tatooine terrifying. Long before smugglers hid in Mos Eisley, long before Jabba ruled from a stolen monastery, and long before Luke Skywalker stared at the twin suns from a moisture farm, Tatooine was not remembered as a dead world of dunes and bone-dry settlements. In Legends, it was a world of oceans, cities, shorelines, and a civilization old enough to be erased so completely that most of the galaxy forgot it had ever existed. Then the oceans were burned away, not by nature, but by an empire ancient enough to turn an entire planet into a punishment. What survived was not simply a desert, it was a scar so large that later generations mistook it for geography. Canon gives us the twin suns, the moisture farms, the crime lords, the Skywalkers, and Obi-Wan's exile. Legends goes deeper into the Rakata, the Kumonga, the star map, and the ancient history hidden beneath the dunes. Together, they reveal why Tatooine has always felt too important to be only a backwater. From orbit, it looks empty. From the ground, it looks poor, hostile, and forgotten. Travelers see twin suns, moisture farms, cantinas, pod racing crowds, Jawas, Tuskens, smugglers, and endless dunes, then leave believing they have seen everything because the surface gives them such an easy answer. Powerful people glanced at it once and dismissed it, which meant criminals could rule it more effectively than any state ever had. Ignored worlds become blind spots, and Tatooine became one of the greatest blind spots in galactic history. In canon, that blind spot hid fugitives, criminals, and eventually the people who would reshape the galaxy. In Legends, it hid something even older, the remains of a destroyed civilization, the descendants of a planetary catastrophe, and Rakatan technology tied to one of the most dangerous weapons ever built. Before Tatooine reveals what is hidden beneath it, a newcomer stepping off a freighter ramp does not encounter silence first, but heat, dry enough to crack lips within minutes, intense enough to pull water from the body faster than fear can name the danger, and relentless enough to make the horizon itself feel hostile. By the second hour, an unprepared traveler is already weakening, and by nightfall, the temperature can fall sharply enough for the cold to finish what the daytime suns began. Tatooine orbits the binary stars Tatoo 1 and Tatoo 2, whose combined glare turns the surface into an exposed furnace. In the open desert, daytime heat can become lethal, nights can drop with brutal speed, and the atmosphere holds so little moisture that survival depends on machines built to harvest traces of water from air that barely has any to give. On Tatooine, water stops being a comfort and becomes currency, which means every settlement, every household, every route, and every act of labor bends around the same fragile resource. Mos Eisley, Mos Espa, Anchorhead, and Bestine were not built to welcome the suns, but to resist them through low structures, shaded corridors, pale walls, and underground rooms where stone and shadow offer the only mercy the planet gives freely. Anyone who survives there long enough learns to move downward, away from glare and wind, toward the cooler spaces where life has a chance to last. Moisture farms are the legitimate economy because vaporators are the difference between a household and a grave. A good season can keep a family alive and leave enough surplus to trade, but a sandstorm, a raid, or a string of failed machines can turn a working farm into a countdown measured in days. Out beyond the settlements, the Dune Sea shifts over sinkholes, wreckage, and sarlacc pits, while krayt dragons move through canyons and desert flats like ancient predators that never accepted civilization's claim over the land. The people outsiders feared most were shaped by that hostility more completely than anyone else. The galaxy has called the Tuskens savages, raiders, and sand people, but each name flattens them into a threat and erases the older truth that they are survivors before they're anything else. To settlers, they appear as masked figures on ridgelines, sudden violence in the dust, and warnings carved into the edge of claimed territory. To Tatooine itself, they're one of the few peoples who learn how to live with the planet instead of pretending it could be tamed. Their wrappings are not decoration, and their marks are not mystery for mystery's sake. Cloth, goggles, breathing filters, layered bindings, and seal coverings are survival against twin sun glare, wind-blown grit, and air too dry to trust. Even the refusal to expose the face belongs to that same logic, because a mask on Tatooine is a boundary between the body and a planet that is always trying to enter through the eyes, lungs, and skin. That memory is the part most outsiders never understood. In Legends, Tusken oral histories preserve echoes of a world before the sand, of conquerors who came from the sky, and of a day when the oceans burned away. What settlers dismiss as hostility becomes something older and darker in that continuity, the inherited defense of a wounded world. The Jawas carry another piece of that wound in a different form. In canon, there are scavengers and traders who move through the desert and sand crawlers, stripping value from wreckage, broken droids, discarded machinery, and whatever the dunes have taken back from people who thought ownership meant permanence. In Legends, their history goes deeper, linking them to the same ancient catastrophe that shaped the Tuskens. Their scavenging stops looking like a joke and starts looking like inheritance, a people-building society from whatever the ruin left behind. The Tuskens adapted to the open desert. The Jawas adapted to the caves, salvage, and machinery. In Legends, both become living evidence that Tatooine's present was formed by something far worse than drought. Before the desert, there were the Kuumga. They were not wanderers moving across dunes, because the dunes did not yet define the world. They were a civilization with settlements, culture, language, technology, and memory anchored to a planet covered by vast bodies of water. Their Tatooine had shorelines, civic life, trade, and geography that later generations would never see, because the world now mistaken for a natural wasteland was not born that way. The Rakata, builders of the Infinite Empire, found the Kuumga civilization and folded Tatooine into their dominion. When the Kuumga rebelled, the Rakata pushed the entire planet from orbit, using weapons powerful enough to vaporize oceans, ruin the climate, and transform a living world into a furnace of exposed stone and sand. This was not a slow drought or a natural collapse, but a sentence carried out on a planetary scale by an empire that treated a world as something that could be destroyed to make a point. Long before the Galactic Republic existed, someone on Tatooine could have stood near a shoreline and watched the horizon become steam. Cities lost the conditions that made them possible. Infrastructure failed beneath a sky that no longer belonged to the same world, and the survivors were left to inherit a planet whose geography had been murdered around them. Over generations, the descendants of the Kuumga became something else in the eyes of outsiders, until the galaxy saw only masked nomads, robed scavengers, and sand. After that destruction, the desert was not empty territory. It was ancestral ground with the water torn out of it, and every settlement built over it, every claim staked into it, every machine sunk into it rested on top of a catastrophe the galaxy chose not to remember. Beneath the world they had broken, they built and buried evidence of why this desert mattered to them. Deep in the eastern Dune Sea, hidden under caves and buried passages, Tatooine held a star map, one of the ancient Rakatan artifacts that pointed towards the Starforge. The star map was not a public monument or a simple navigation device, but a preserved mechanism from an empire old enough to feel almost mythic, protected by the heat, dryness, and neglect of the same desert the Rakata helped create. The Starforge itself was not merely a factory, In Legends, it was a colossal weapon-making station tied to the dark side of the Force, capable of producing fleets and armaments at a scale that could feed conquest without end. The Rakata considered this world important enough to mark with technology connected to their most dangerous creation, and the desert they created became the desert that hid the evidence. Their punishment covered their footprint, their ruin became their vault, and by the time the galaxy dismissed Tatooine as a wasteland, the desert had become its luck. For thousands of years, the star map remained under the sand while Republic officials, Imperial scouts, moisture farmers, smugglers, settlers, and criminals moved across the surface with no idea that a key to an ancient superweapon lay beneath one of the most overlooked planets in the galaxy. The star map is the clearest surviving sign from that legend's history, but it is not the only suggestion that Tatooine's buried past runs deeper than its modern settlements. Old ruins, anomalous formations, and remnants from eras no modern authorities seriously studied remain scattered across the planet, some perhaps Rakatan, some perhaps Kumamga, and some belonging to chapters of Tatooine's past, erased so completely that even their names are gone. It does not only cover bones and machines, but covers meaning until the record itself becomes unreadable, turning cities into ridges, temples into caves, weapons into rumors, and entire civilizations into things later travelers mistake for weathered rock. On Tatooine, the people with official titles were rarely the ones who controlled the planet's real machinery. Power belonged to whoever controlled debt, water, roots, labor, weapons, and fear, which made the planet useful to anyone who understood that a neglected world can be more valuable than a conquered one. The Republic's absence left space. The Empire's indifference widened it, and into that space came corporations, syndicates, and crime lords who treated Tatooine's isolation as permission. Shirka belongs to the older Legends layer of that exploitation, a corporate power that treated Tusken resistance as an obstacle rather than the defense of ancestral ground. Later, in the more familiar era, the Hutts turned the same lawless geography into a throne. Jabba did not need a government office because his palace, guards, debts, punishments, and favors became government enough. His authority was not written into law, but into the behavior of everyone who lowered their voice when his name entered a room. His palace had once been a monastery, which makes its later purpose feel like part of Tatooine's curse. A palace built for devotion became a monument to appetite, with petitioners entering beneath heavy stone and dim light while the rancor pit waited below the floor. The bones of previous failures did more than decorate the chamber. They explained the rules of power on Tatooine without anyone needing to speak them aloud. Mos Espa's pod racing crowds, Mos Eisley's cantinas, the spice routes, the backroom bargains, and the quiet exchange of people and parts all belonged to the same ecosystem. Pod racing looked like entertainment from the stands, but beneath the engine scream and cheering crowds moved debts, wagers, favors, and messages no court would ever see. Nothing needed to look organized from orbit, because on the ground, everyone knew who collected, who punished, who protected, and who could make a person disappear into the sand without paperwork. For servitude was the darkest part of that order, because it was not hidden in caves or buried ruins. It existed in the open, woven into markets, homes, farms, racing economies, palace compounds, and private ownership with a cruelty that had become ordinary through repetition. Bound laborers were controlled not only by threat, debt, and violence, but by devices implanted beneath the skin, making escape more dangerous and turning the thought of freedom into something another person could punish with the press of a trigger. Anakin Skywalker and his mother Shmi became the most widely known people held in bondage on Tatooine, not because their experience was unique, but because it was, in all essential details, completely ordinary. Shmi raised the most Force-sensitive child ever recorded in a Mos Espa slave quarter, while the Republic that claimed moral authority over the galaxy remained too distant to know her name. When Anakin left, she stayed behind, and the desert kept the part of the story the Jedi did not carry with them. The boy became prophecy to the Order, while the mother remained what Tatooine had made her in the eyes of the galaxy, a woman whose suffering could disappear because the world around her had already been dismissed. In Legends, the Rakata came and left a ruined climate, Churka came and left scars on the people who already lived there. The Hutts came and built power out of fear and bondage. Later, the Pikes treated Tatooine as one useful piece of a wider spice network rather than the center of their entire empire. Every age of Tatooine's history shows the same progression, in which outsiders arrive because the planet seems too remote to be watched, take what they can, and leave the consequences to be buried with everything else. Tatooine had already hidden ruins, survivors, criminals, and the evidence of a murdered ocean, but the deepest layer was not only historical, it reached into the spiritual imagination of the Star Wars galaxy. History kept returning to Tatooine long after the galaxy stopped looking at it. In Legends, ancient Rakatan technology slept beneath its dunes, and the descendants of a destroyed civilization carried memories of oceans through masks and salvage routes. In canon, a slave child born there became the Chosen One. His son was hidden there, and the Jedi Master who trained him vanished there for nearly 20 years, while the Empire hunted survivors across the galaxy. Anakin Skywalker should have been impossible to miss. His midichlorian count was unprecedented, his birth had no recorded father, and his power exceeded anything the Jedi Order had measured. Yet he grew up in a slave quarter on Tatooine, surrounded by dust, junk, market noise, and people too poor to attract institutional attention. Luke Skywalker survived for the same reason. A powerful child, hidden on a monitored core world, would have disturbed the surface of too many systems, but on Tatooine, he became another farm boy on another moisture farm under the same twin suns that had hidden everything else. Obi-Wan Kenobi's exile worked because the planet was not quiet in a peaceful way. It was quiet in the way abandoned places are quiet, filled with noise that nobody important bothers to interpret. The Force does not always gather around temples, capitals, or battlefields that announce themselves to history. Sometimes, the most important events happen where trauma, secrecy, survival, and neglect overlap so completely that the galaxy mistakes significance for emptiness. On Tatooine, prophecy did not arrive surrounded by marble halls or Jedi archives, but through a junk shop, a slave quarter, a desert hut, and a farm where the horizon looked endless enough to hide destiny in plain sight. By the end, the image of the planet changes completely. The surface still says desert, but beneath that surface is a world whose hostility kept outsiders away, whose native peoples carry memories of survival, whose Legends history preserves Rakatan machinery tied to an ancient superweapon, whose criminal powers thrived because neglect became protection, and whose repeated connection to the Skywalkers and Obi-Wan made it one of the most consequential backwaters in the galaxy. Tatooine was never empty, it was covered. The dunes were not the absence of history, but the evidence that history had been buried deep enough for the galaxy to mistake a wound for a wasteland. Tatooine was a wound the galaxy buried under sand. The next planet is a wound nobody covered up because the people who controlled it preferred it open. Mustafar should have cooled and settled into something else thousands of years ago, and the fact that it didn't has nothing to do with the planet itself. Mustafar sits locked between two massive gas giants, and the gravitational pull from both subjects the planet to a process called tidal forcing. Competing gravitational fields constantly flex and compress the planetary body from the outside in, generating enormous internal friction. You can see a milder version of this on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, the most volcanically active body in our own solar system for exactly this reason. But what Io experiences and what Mustafar experiences are not the same thing. In any tidally stressed world, the energy cycles eventually find equilibrium. Material erupts, cools, resettles, and the internal pressure redistributes. Mustafar has never done this. Every simulation ever run on the planet's behavior reaches the same conclusion. The geological forces at work should have either torn the planet apart or burned themselves out long before the events of the Clone Wars. The volcanic activity is not just intense, it is constant, self-perpetuating, and operating at a sustained maximum that defies every model of natural planetary behavior. The planet should be dead. Instead, it rages. Something is feeding it deliberately. The Jedi avoided Mustafar almost entirely during the height of the Republic. The dark side saturation made it hostile territory, a place where your connection to the Force worked against you, amplifying doubt and fear in ways that could fracture even the most disciplined composure. Most historical accounts simply note that the planet was volcanic and leave it there. That explanation was never the whole story. The volcanic activity was a symptom, not a cause, and no one who accepted it as the answer ever asked why it hadn't burned itself out. The answer lies far in the past, in a time when Mustafar looked nothing like the world that forged Darth Vader. Back when it had water and forests and open skies. And back to the moment one person's grief ended all of that and left behind something that the Sith would spend centuries learning how to use. Chapter 2: The World That Was Lost. Beneath Mustafar's lava-covered surface, the evidence of a completely different world is still there if you know where to look. Deep geological scans have revealed fossilized forests buried under layers of volcanic rock, their root systems still intact, stretching across regions that are now nothing but scorched plains and rivers of molten stone. In other areas, scientists have uncovered dried basins that were once inland seas, complete with the calcified remains of aquatic species that could not survive in extreme heat. The biological record is unambiguous. This planet supported a complex, thriving ecosystem at some point in the relatively recent past. The native Mustafarians have always shown this. Their oldest oral traditions speak of a time called the Bright Star, an era when their world was filled with water, with open skies not yet choked by ash, with vegetations and light and the kind of stability that lets a culture build and remember across generations. For a long time, the wider galaxy dismissed these stories as mythology. The geological record proves they were not. The Bright Star was real, and the person who ended it wasn't a conqueror. She was someone trying to save the person she loved. Her name was Lady Korvax. She was force-sensitive, powerful, and consumed entirely by grief. Her husband had died, and she refused to accept that death as final. That impulse is not unique in the history of the Force. The desire to reach past death, to undo loss, to recover what was taken, it appears again and again in the stories of those who interact with the Force at the deepest levels. What made Korvax different was not the grief itself, it was what she found to act on it. The Aeon engine was an ancient piece of Force-based technology, unlike anything else documented in galactic history. Its precise origins are unclear, but its function was extraordinary. The device could interface directly with the life energy of an entire planetary body, not the Force connection of individual beings, but the accumulated biological and spiritual energy of a whole world, its ecosystems, its creatures, the resonance built up over centuries of organic life existing in relationship with a place. She believed she could use it to reach past death. What she didn't know was what the attempt would cost everyone else. Korvax believed she could draw on that energy and redirect it towards something the Force had taken from her. If the device could tap into the full life resonance of a living planet, perhaps the boundary between life and death could be weakened enough to pull someone back through it. This is the same reasoning that would draw Vader to Mustafar thousands of years later. It is the same logic Palpatine used when he whispered to Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis. The desire to reverse death through Force-based intervention is not an invention of the dark side. It is something close to a universal impulse, and the dark side has always known how to use it. Korvax was not a Sith. She was someone in agony who found a tool that seemed to offer a way through that agony and used it without fully understanding what she was holding. The horror of what happened to Mustafar is not that it was done by a monster, it is that it was done by someone who loved deeply, reached too far, and left an entire world paying the price for that reach. The attempt failed catastrophically. Instead of drawing energy outward, the Aeon engine destabilized and turned inward. It began consuming the planet rather than channeling it, pulling thermal, biological, and Force energy simultaneously into an accelerating feedback loop. The planet's core ignited. Tectonic systems that had been stable for millennia fractured in sequence. Oceans evaporated, forests burned to nothing in hours. The bright star didn't fade, it was extinguished in hours, and the damage didn't stop when the fires did. The atmosphere, once clear enough for open skies, thickened into toxic ash that would not clear for thousands of years. The bright star that the Mustafarians' ancestors had known, the open skies, the water, the living world, was gone in the span of a single catastrophe. Horvax had not saved their husband. She had destroyed an entire world in the attempt, and she had done it alone. Every living thing that died in the transformation fed that wound and made it deeper. Mustafar was not simply destroyed, it became something else entirely. And that something else was exactly what the Sith had been looking for. Chapter 3: The Korvax Catastrophe. The Sith did not stumble onto Mustafar, they were drawn to it. A wound in the force of the scale created by the Korvax catastrophe does not go unnoticed by beings who spend their lives attuned to dark side energy. The versions that formed at the side of the Aeon engine's failure was not a subtle disturbance, it was a concentrated rupture. A place where the membrane between the physical world and the Force had been torn thin by the violent death of an entire biosphere. For a Jedi, this would register as a place to avoid. For the Sith, it registered as something they had never found before, a natural amplifier, a source of raw dark side power that required no construction, no ritual, no maintenance. Vergences exist throughout the galaxy. The cave beneath the ancient tree on Dagobah is one. The wellspring beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant is another. Most of them form gradually, the accumulated resonance of significant events or of Force-sensitive beings spending centuries in a single location. The Mustafar Vergence was different in kind. It did not accumulate gradually, it was created in an instant, in a catastrophic discharge of Force energy that left the site permanently saturated with dark power. That origin gave it qualities that could not be replicated artificially: raw volatility, extreme concentration, and a sustained instability that made dark side techniques feel effortless in a way they did not anywhere else in the galaxy. Rituals conducted there were stronger. Artifacts stored there absorbed and held dark side charge in ways that artifacts elsewhere simply could not. The planet functioned as an amplification system, and the Sith moved quickly to claim it. Artifacts of immense power were transported there and buried beneath the surface, where the Vergence would preserve and strengthen them indefinitely. Experiments were conducted in the volcanic depths, explorations of dark side capability that required the kind of energy concentration only Mustafar could provide. Texts and techniques and histories that the Sith considered too volatile to risk in locations the Jedi might find were encoded and stored there. For generations, the arrangement held. The Sith grew stronger. Their artifacts deepened in charge. Their rituals reached levels of power that would have been impossible anywhere else. And the Mustafarians, adapted to their volcanic world and unaware of what lay beneath their feet, continued to survive inside a catastrophe that someone else had decided was too useful to end. It was, by any measure, a perfect arrangement, which is exactly why the Sith spent so much effort making sure it can never change. For the Sith, it was nearly perfect, nearly because the power they were drawing on was not a stable resource. Every dark side tradition understood, at some level, that Vergences were not permanent features of a landscape. They were concentrations of Force energy that had accumulated under specific conditions. Change those conditions, and the Vergence changed with them. Mustafar's Vergence was sustained by the Aeon engine's ongoing disruption of the planet's Force resonance, a disruption that the planet's own natural processes would eventually work to correct, the same way any wound, left alone, eventually begins to close. The Sith were sophisticated enough to understand this, and that understanding forced them towards the most consequential decision they would ever make on Mustafar. The Vergence was only this powerful because the wound was still open. A heal Mustafar, a world where the Aeon engine's damage had been reversed, where the ecosystems had recovered, and the Force resonance had returned to something balanced, would not have generated this kind of dark side energy. The power came from the ongoing rupture. It came from the sustained, unresolved catastrophe. Sith philosophy has always held that strength justifies its own exercise. On Mustafar, that philosophy reached one of its most extreme conclusions. It is worth pausing on the full weight of that. The Sith were not ignorant of what Mustafar had been. The geological and force-based evidence of a once-living world was not hidden from them. They were among the most thorough researchers of planetary history in the galaxy. They knew the Mustafarians had survived. They knew an entire culture had adapted to conditions that should never have been permanent. They knew, when they found the Aeon engine, that there was a path back to what the planet had been. And they made a decision, not out of ignorance, not out of necessity, but out of calculation. Chapter 4. Why the Sith chose Mustafar. At some point during their occupation of Mustafar, the Sith made a discovery that should have changed the planet's fate. The Aeon engine was still there, buried beneath the volcanic surface, damaged but intact. The device that had caused the catastrophe had survived it. Sith scholars and archaeologists eventually located it and assessed its condition, and what they found would have been extraordinarily good news to anyone who did not have a vested interest in keeping Mustafar broken. The damage was not permanent. The Aeon engine could be repaired. The engineering required was not simple, and the process would have demanded significant time and resources, but it was achievable. More importantly, a repaired engine would not simply stop draining the planet. Because of the way the device interfaced with planetary life force, a functional Aeon engine running in its intended mode would actively reverse the damage it had caused. The volcanic activity would subside as the tectonic system stabilized. The dark side vergence, sustained entirely by the ongoing rupture, would dissipate as the wound in the force began to close. Given enough time, the ecosystems could return. The planet could breathe again. Mustafar could be restored to what it had been before Korvax activated the engine. The Sith did not repair it, and that single decision condemned an entire world to thousands more years of destruction. A living Mustafar would have been worthless to them. The entire basis of the planet's value as a stronghold was the Virgins, and the Virgins existed because the wound existed. Restoring the planet would have eliminated the very thing that made it useful. So instead, they did something methodical and deliberate. They made sure the wound could never close. There is a distinction here that matters. The Sith did not cause what happened to Mustafar. Korvax caused it, alone, driven by grief, and by a technology she did not fully understand. The Sith bore no responsibility for the original catastrophe. What they are responsible for is every decision they made after the moment they understood what the Aeon engine represented and chose to leave it buried. The original destruction was an accident. What followed was a policy. For thousands of years, every Sith presence on Mustafar operated under a system deliberately designed to prevent the planet from ever recovering. Every ritual conducted there, every artifact stored there, every piece of dark side knowledge encoded and hidden in the volcanic depths, all of it ran on power that depended on a wound staying open that the Sith had specifically chosen to keep that way. Sith artifacts known as dark side totems were placed at calculated positions across the planet's surface. These were not decorative markers, they were functional anchors, devices engineered specifically to channel dark side energy into the planet's wound and reinforce the conditions maintaining it. Each totem held a corruption in place, suppressed the natural processes that would otherwise have begun drawing the rupture closed, and ensured that the volcanic activity and dark side saturation remained at the intensity the Sith required. The system was not passive. It required ongoing maintenance and intent. The Sith were not simply exploiting a damaged world, they were actively managing its damage, day after day, century after century, to make sure it never healed. The implications, spelled out plainly, were difficult to ignore. They looked at an entire civilization living inside ongoing destruction and decided that destruction was more valuable than the people suffering through it. The Mustafarians kept their oral traditions alive through all of it. They maintained the memory of the bright star and told their children about a green world that existed before the burning, a world they had no reason to expect would ever return. And all of that time, buried beneath the surface of their home, was a device that could have ended their suffering, surrounded by a network of Sith artifacts specifically designed to make sure it never would. That was the dark truth the Sith buried on Mustafar, and Vader would soon arrive to push it further than anyone before him had dared. Chapter 5. Vader's Fortress. Darth Vader chose Mustafar not as a monument to his past and not as a symbol of his fall. He chose it as a tool, a mechanism he believed could do something no other location in the galaxy was capable of doing. He wanted to use the wound in the Force to reach through death itself. The full story of how the fortress was built is documented in the Darth Vader comic series by Charles Soule. It begins with a spirit named Momin, an ancient Sith Lord whose consciousness had been preserved in a mask that Darth Sidious gave to Vader. Momin had spent centuries trapped in the object, waiting for a host and a purpose. Vader provided both. His expertise was architecture as a Force instrument. He understood, at a level no one else had mapped, how physical structures could be designed to channel, concentrate, and direct Force energy. Vader gave him Mustafar, the most powerful darkside versions in the known galaxy, and a single directive: build something that could open a door between the living world and the dead one. The construction took years. Early versions of the fortress had failed repeatedly, each collapse caused by the structure's inability to handle the volume of darkside energy rising from the virgins below. Mustafarian workers died in the backlash. Momin kept iterating, each failure feeding information back into the next attempt. What eventually emerged was not a castle in any conventional sense. Every element of its architecture served the same function. The towers were positioned not for aesthetics, but to catch and redirect the darkside energy rising from the planet's wound. The angles of the walls, the depth of the foundation shafts, the geometry of the internal chambers, all of it was engineered to draw the virgins upward from beneath the surface, concentrate it through the structure, and focus it into a single point deep in the complex. The whole building was a lens. The virgins was the light it was focusing. Vader had not built a home on Mustafar, he had built a machine designed to break the boundary between life and death. His fall to the dark side had been built entirely around the fear of losing Padme, and everything Palpatine had told him about the dark side's power over death had been aimed at exactly that fear. Vader had lived for years knowing the promise was hollow, that Padme had died, that the dark side had not saved her, that everything he had destroyed had been destroyed for nothing. The fortress was his attempt to prove that the power was real after all, not to undo what had happened, but to reach her, to find whatever remained of her on the other side of death and make some form of contact with it. Two people, separated by thousands of years, both driven to the same world by the same grief. Korvax and Vader, both attempting to use the same wound in the Force to reach past death to someone they had lost. Korvax used the Aeon engine and destroyed a world in the attempt. Vader used a fortress designed by a Sith spirit and failed more quietly, withdrawing from the threshold with whatever he had encountered on the other side, locked away in a silence he never broke. The dark side could pull out the boundary between life and death and make it temporarily thin, but it could not do what either of them needed it to do. The wound in the Force is not a door. It cannot be made into one, no matter how precisely the architecture is designed or how much power is concentrated through it. And what the fortress reveals, across the whole arc of Mustafar's history, is the logical endpoint of everything the Sith had been building toward since they first set foot on this planet. They found a wound and chose to keep it open. They built a system to hold that wound against the natural forces that would have closed it. Their greatest lord then built a machine directly over that wound and tried to reach through it into death. Each step follows from the last, each a more extreme version of the same impulse, the belief that the dark side's power over suffering is the same as power over the Force. The fortress is that philosophy made physical. And like the philosophy, it reached its absolute limit the moment it was pushed furthest. The ritual was activated. The energy of the Virgin surged through the fortress at full intensity. For a moment, and the comics render this with a quiet devastation the films never matched, the barrier between the living Force and what lies beyond it began to thin, and Vader stepped through. He reached something. He experienced something on the other side that the comic leaves deliberately ambiguous. Whether it was Padme, a shadow of her, something darker wearing her shape, or simply the confirmation that the boundary could not be crossed. But it did not work. The attempt collapsed. Vader withdrew. The fortress stood intact, its architecture still fully functional, its purpose now permanently unrealized. He never came back to try again. A man who had destroyed everything in pursuit of a single promise had pushed that promise as far back as it could go, in the one place in the galaxy most designed to make it possible, and come back alone. The dark side had not lied to him about the power. It had simply never told him what the power could not do. Chapter 6. The Secret the Sith Hid. The Sith found the Aeon Engine and made a choice that most accounts of this planet never fully reckon with. They did not destroy it, did not fear it, did not hide it out of ignorance. They assessed it with full knowledge of what it was, concluded that a repaired engine would cost them everything they had built on this planet, and decided to ensure it can never be used again. But every system built on suppression has a breaking point, and when the Sith finally fell, Mustafar would begin doing something no one alive had ever seen it do. Something that proved everything the Sith had built here was never as permanent as they believed. That story is next. Chapter 7. A Planet Beginning to Heal. With the fall of the Sith, the system they had spent centuries building to keep Mustafar broken began to come apart. The dark side totems anchored across the planet's surface were not passive structures. They required the active current of Sith practice and intent flowing through them to hold the wound open. When the Sith fell, when Sidious died at Exegol and the order he had maintained collapsed, that current broke. The totems began to fail, not immediately since these were ancient structures with deep roots in the planet's geology and force resonance, but progressively. One anchor point weakened, then another. Then, the system as a whole began to lose the coherence that had made it effective for so long. No one directed this. No one activated anything. The structures the Sith had built simply stopped receiving what they needed to function, and without them, Mustafar was left alone with its own nature for the first time in millennia. And for the first time in thousands of years, the planet began to answer. And as the artificial system failed, the natural one began to reassert itself. The volcanic cycles that had been sustained at maximum intensity by the anchored wound started to moderate. Lava flows that had been continuous for as long as anyone alive could remember began to slow and cool in sections, leaving solid ground where there had been none. The atmosphere, choked for millennia with volcanic particulate and dark side resonance, began to thin in certain regions. Not dramatically, not uniformly across the whole planet, but measurably. And then, in areas where the lava had cooled long enough for stable ground to form, and where the atmosphere had shifted enough to allow for something other than ash, plant life began to appear. Mosses first, then ground cover, small and isolated at first, the kind of pioneer organisms that colonize newly stable ground before anything more complex can follow. But present, alive, on a world that had not supported visible plant life in thousands of years. This was not just recovery, this was proof that everything the Sith had built on Mustafar had been a lie. If Mustafar's condition had been the result of natural forces, the tidal compression from the gas giants, the instability of its orbital position, then the fall of the Sith would have changed nothing. The planet would have kept burning regardless of what happened to its most recent occupants, because natural forces do not respond to political events. The gravitational relationship between Mustafar and the gas giants on either side of it was not affected by Sidious dying at Exegol, but Mustafar began to heal the moment the Sith-built system maintaining its destruction failed. That is not a coincidence, that is causation. The wound was artificial, the maintenance was real, and without the maintenance, the planet began to do what it would have done centuries earlier if the Sith had not intervened. It started recovering. The Mustafarians noticed. Their oral traditions, which had carried the memory of the bright star across thousands of years of volcanic darkness, began to take on a different quality. Not just memory of what had been lost, but something closer to anticipation. The elders who maintained the stories of the Green World for generations they had no reason to believe would see any change began to speak differently about what might still be possible. For the first time in thousands of years, the bright star was not just a memory, it was beginning to look like a direction. Whether that recovery will ever reach the scale of what Mustafar was before the Korvax catastrophe is a question that remains genuinely open. The Aeon engine is still buried somewhere beneath the surface. Whether anyone will ever locate it, repair it, and use it as Korvax intended to restore rather than drain, is not answered by current canon. But the direction has changed, and the reason it changed tells you everything you need to know about what the Sith actually were on this planet. They found a world that someone else had broken by accident. They found a device that could have fixed it, chose to leave it buried, and spent centuries actively suppressing any chance of recovery because a broken Mustafar made them stronger than a living one ever could. They built totems to hold a wound open. They raised a fortress over it and tried to reach through it into death. They kept an entire people living inside destruction that existed only because their suffering was useful. The Mustafarians told their children about the bright star for thousands of years, never knowing that the reason it could not return was because someone had made sure it wouldn't. The Sith were wrong about a great many things, but the most consequential thing they were wrong about was this: that wounds held open by Force stay open forever. They don't. The moment the Force holding Mustafar broken was removed, the planet began to prove it. The Force does not remain broken forever, not because of some abstract guarantee, but because the structures that hold wounds open are mortal. They depend on the beings who built them remaining in power, remaining committed to a philosophy of extraction that eventually consumes the people practicing it as thoroughly as it consumes everything around them. The Sith built their power on a wound in the Force. When they were gone, the wound began to close, and Mustafar, slowly, imperfectly, and against all the odds of its own history, began to remember what it had been. The bright star that the Mustafarians had kept alive in history for thousands of years was not just a memory of the past, it was, finally, a description of what was coming. Mustafar was the planet the Sith broke and kept broken. Coruscant was the planet they kept polished while burying things underneath the surface. The largest of those buried things was a warship, and the man who put it there was the same man who ruled the galaxy from the throne above. In the year 7 ABY, a New Republic general named Crix Medine watched something impossible climb out of the city of Coruscant. By that point, the ship had been buried on Coruscant for years, hidden through the latter part of the Galactic Civil War. None of his intelligence analysts, none of his spies, and none of his rebel scouts had ever placed it on a map. As the warship cleared the atmosphere, he said a single thing out loud. The ship had not come to fight, it was running. Even as the ruler of the galaxy, he had already prepared a way to escape. Across both Canon and Legends, the same pattern keeps surfacing. A ruler of the entire galaxy spent his reign building escape plans, hiding them from his closest subordinates, and placing them beneath his own throne. The ship under Coruscant was only the largest piece of evidence. Most of what is known about the Lusankia comes from Legends material, where its burial, its use as a prison, and its role as an escape plan are described in full. Canon sources confirm the ship's existence and its construction, but not the full scope of how it was used. Before the ground ever opened, what the Empire was burying was already a secret. The records hid one ship, the capital hid another. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, documents how the Navy had long treated the Super Star Destroyer as a second-tier project, a prestige concession that the service accepted as a lesser evil once the Death Star overshadowed naval priorities. That standing reversed overnight at Yavin. When Rebel pilots destroyed the battle station, the giant warships the Empire had treated as backdrop became the main program. What looked from the outside like a panicked response had started long before the panic. Legends reference material identifies the Kuat-built ship's internal name during construction. It was called Executor 2. In Imperial records, there was only ever one Super Star Destroyer in progress, and that ship was Vader's public flagship at Fondor. The second ship did not exist on paper. By listing all of the Lusankia's costs as part of the Executor's construction, the Empire kept the second hull's existence a secret from the galaxy. The cover story did its work. Outside observers, including Rebel intelligence and rival Imperial power centers, never learned that a second hull existed. Years later, New Republic analyst Winter would confirm the trick in a briefing to Rogue Squadron. Both shipyards had insisted they alone built the Executor, neither was lying. The two warships were identical by design, and only the Fondor ship ever joined the public fleet. The other, wherever it was, had a different destination. That destination was not a shipyard, not a port, and not even orbit. Before that reveal, the pattern deserves context, because the Lusankia was not the first thing Palpatine hid using this method. The novel Catalyst documents the same deception running across the Death Star itself. The superweapon had been hidden behind a public program called Project Celestial Power, presented to the galaxy as a clean energy effort. Components were built under fake names like Stellar Sphere, Mark Omega, and Pax Aurora. Whole teams of scientists worked inside what the same storyline calls fake divisions, never told what their research actually built. The canon novel Tarkin extends the rule further. No base commander, no Moff, no admiral, and no general was ever given full access to information on the Death Star shipments, timelines, or building progress. The book reveals that the Emperor was the only person who knew the complete story of the project. A ruler that was determined to control information was a ruler determined never to lose control of his own escape, and that rule, applied to a warship, is how a secret this size stays buried. The same novel shows one more detail that matters for what comes next. During the construction of the military intelligence complex on Coruscant, Palpatine ordered tiny hidden cameras installed in every corner of the building, so he could watch and listen to his own spy masters at any hour. The ruler of the galaxy did not trust even the people he had chosen to run his secret service. Surveillance was only one half of the habit. The other half was preparing for the day he might need to disappear from his own throne. The same mindset, taken further, produced something much larger. The Emperor's next move was to bury a super star destroyer beneath Coruscant's cityscape, on the later site linked to Armand Izard's old underground headquarters. The reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, reveals something that most fans do not know. The name Lusankia had existed long before the ship did. It was originally a forgotten district of Galactic City on Coruscant, a part of the capital that had been buried under later construction and turned into a hidden prison by the Senate Bureau of Intelligence. The director of that agency was a man named Armand Izard, whose daughter Isan grew up inside the buried facility. So when Palpatine buried the Super Star Destroyer, he did not choose a random spot. He placed it directly on top of a site that had already been used to hide things beneath the capital. The warship inherited the name of the district above it and the tradition of secrecy that came with it. The city itself was rebuilt on top of the ship. Starships of the Galaxy gives the cleanest version of the burial. The finished warship was wrapped in a massive outer frame of beams and electronics. That shell was designed to make the Lusankia look, from the outside, like a giant planetary shield generator. Beneath it sat a second structure, a huge six-sided platform made of thousands of repulsor lift cells stitched together. The whole disguised package was then lowered onto the surface and sealed into the planet. The Legends novel Wedge's Gamble confirms the general mechanism. Giant Imperial construction droids routinely tore down and rebuilt Coruscant's cityscape, large enough to reshape whole districts as part of the capital's ongoing construction cycle. The tools for hiding something under the surface were already in regular use above it. In the Kratos Trap, New Republic General Aaron Kraken adds the missing piece. The rebellion, he explains, had earlier traced enormous Imperial procurement of repulsor lift components, but had never been able to pin down where the shipments were going. After the launch, the answer was clear. Those parts had gone into the ship's lifting cradle. Droids erased a district and rebuilt a new one on top of the hidden warship. From street level, nothing looked unusual. The mechanical part, however, was solvable. The part no one has ever fully explained is how the Emperor kept every witness quiet. Thousands of workers, engineers, and pilots saw the burial happen. Any one of them could have spoken. The most direct statement on record comes from the one person Palpatine eventually trusted with the ship, and even she could not solve the mystery. The book Izard's Revenge records it in her own words. Ivan Izard, the Emperor's director of Imperial Intelligence, described the burial as a mystery she never cracked. She knew where and when the Lusankia had been created, and she knew the date it was given to her. As head of Imperial Intelligence, however, she could find no clue as to how the warship had been placed into the planet. Her best guess involved the Force, a power she did not understand and could not use. The Sith Lord, she said, may have pulled the warship down and buried it directly through the dark side itself, or he may have reached out with his mind and blocked anyone from noticing the descent as it happened. She cannot rule either idea out. In the same storyline, Wedge Antilles reached a darker answer. If Palpatine had not used the Force to wipe the memories of every witness, then the likely alternative was that the Emperor had ordered the deaths of every person who saw the ship go into the ground. Either way, the secret held. The same ruler who wired his own spy agency with surveillance during its construction was not a ruler who left a burial operation to chance. One way or another, the witnesses stopped being a problem, and there is a troubling match for exactly that kind of behavior. The novel Tarkin describes another hidden project directly under the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, an ancient Sith hideout dug out in total secret secrecy. The excavation and restoration were carried out by machines, watched over by a single droid. No living person other than Sidious himself ever walked inside. Vader did not know the chamber existed. The pattern is the same. The scale is what differs. Once the warship was in the ground, it was given over. Izard's Revenge records the handover. The Emperor took his stand there alone, through one of what the book calls his hidden sanctums and side palaces scattered across Coruscant. Palpatine gave her privileged access to the buried warship and had her private quarters finished in fine, rare woods chosen to please her. The ship's handover was treated as a singular act of trust given to the one person the Emperor kept closest to the operation. The same novel gives a clean date for the handover. The Sith Lord told her its location at roughly the same time its sister ship, the Executor, entered service. The handover happened in parallel with the public flagship's commissioning, not after it. The two ships, and the two men who would command them in the Emperor's name, rose together. Why this woman? That question has a complicated answer, and it is the first hint of what Palpatine actually planned to use the Lusankia for. Her background is laid out in the Bacta War. Ysanne Izard took her father's job after selling him out as a suspected supporter of the rebellion. She turned her own father in, took his position as Director of Imperial Intelligence, and served the Emperor from the top of his own spy agency. Rumors inside the Empire also held that she had once been one of Palpatine's lovers, a claim the novel records as part of her reputation. What the sources confirm is the betrayal. The woman Palpatine chose as custodian of the Lusankia had risen through her own family treachery, and the Emperor placed a hidden warship in her hands anyway, which matches what the ship became. Under the Director, the Lusankia turned into something else entirely. In the Kratos Trap, General Kraken describes the program. People who came out of the buried warship had been brainwashed into Imperial operatives who would turn on their own friends, family, and commanders when Izard activated them. Prisoners were given code markings. Rogue Squadron pilots Corran Horn and Tycho Selchu were both labeled C-Status R1, meaning resistant in the early phase. Each pilot had been run through simulator flights designed to get them to fire on rebel symbols. Both refused. The Empire marked them as failures and kept them locked up anyway. A prison this elaborate inside a warship this size was never really built for the prisoners. It was built for the man who owned it. The prisoners believed they were deep underground in some distant backwater world. The inside of the warship had been built to match that lie in every detail. The novel describes the prison block as made to look ground and drilled out of solid rock, with thick dust, uneven rock walls, and worn tools that convinced captives the place had been built before the Clone Wars. Inmates worked fake shifts with sledgehammers inside a staged gravel mine. Elsewhere in the same facility, on the route Corran Horn later used to escape, a 10-foot hologram of the Emperor stood in another chamber, placed to block the exact spot of a hidden escape lift. The lie about where the prisoners were standing was not for them, it was for the day a real escape plan needed every secret around it to hold. The prison took people the galaxy thought were already dead. Jan Dodona, the rebel general who had planned the Death Star attack at Yavin, sat inside that complex for 7 years. The galaxy believed he had died during the evacuation of Yavin 4. He was alive the entire time, locked up under the Capitol. As detailed in the same book, Derek Waziri, husband of New Republic intelligence officer Yella Waziri, was broken inside the facility and turned into a sleeper killer who did not remember his time there at all. What Izard did to the mine, however, was only the half of it the prisoners could see. Another inmate carried a secret his killers built into his own body. Erlor Sete had a hidden device sewn inside him. When Corran Horn identified him by name at a later Rogue Squadron gathering, the implant recognized Corran's stored voice print and activated. Blood poured from his eyes and nose. His bones snapped under their own weight, and he died on the spot. The Empire had built remote kill switches into the bodies of its own prisoners so that no escaped agent would ever live long enough to tell the story. Corran summed it up in one line. People who came out of there, he said, were human remote weapons. They did terrible things when the Empire switched them on, none of which made sense as the work of a prison. It made perfect sense as the work of a contingency, kept alive in case the man who built it ever needed deniable agents in a galaxy that had stopped recognizing his rule. When Corran himself was finally captured, Izard called the Lusankia her private workshop for people like him. He became the first prisoner ever to escape, a feat the novel calls never before successfully accomplished. When he worked his way out of the fake mine and looked back, he discovered something that changed what the Lusankia had really been. The bulkhead doors he had assumed were pulled from wrecked ships were actually part of a ship. The prisoners had been living packed inside the lower part of an Imperial Super Star Destroyer dressed up to look like a hole in the ground, which left the question that the buried warship had been quietly raising the whole time. The cells were elaborate. The ship around them was overkill. The handful of cells that held Adona, Tycho, and Corran could have fit inside a bunker a tiny fraction of the ship's size. A prison does not need hyperdrives, a crew of over 250,000, or a full stormtrooper force, so that was what the rest of the Lusankia was for. The Legends novel, The Back to War, answers it in a single line from Winter's briefing. The Lusankia had been buried on Coruscant, in her words, probably to serve as the Emperor's getaway ship. This was the same conclusion General Medine reached watching the launch above Coruscant, a ship heading out, not digging in, escape, not conquest. Starships of the Galaxy pushes the answer further. The book describes the Lusankia as fully equipped to smash through a planet's defenses by itself and take control of its major cities. Unlike other Super Star Destroyers, which needed support fleets, it was, on its own, enough to build a new small multi-planet government. The design proves it. The Lusankia had fewer heavy guns than a standard executor class, trading firepower for more troop space, better computers, and room for prisoners. Taken together, the sources make the Lusankia read less like a warship and more like a mobile seat of power. If the capital ever fell, Palpatine could board, launch, seize a new world, and rebuild his rule from the hull outward. He would arrive with his own stormtrooper force, his own command staff, and his own prisoners for interrogation. One ship would carry the operational backbone of a surviving empire. The novel Lords of the Sith shows the same habit on a smaller scale. When a rebel sabotage attempt threatened a Star Destroyer the Emperor was aboard, Sidious calmly told Vader he had a second escape shuttle ready in a different hangar and had not bothered to mention it. Vader had not known about the backup shuttle, but he was not surprised. His master prepared for almost every outcome. The Lusankia is the same instinct, scaled up to the size of a capital ship. The technical breakdown in Starships of the Galaxy confirms the design with hard numbers. The Lusankia carried 207,381 crew, 57,000 troops, and could hold 115,000 prisoners. It launched 72 starfighters along with up to 1,000 smaller craft for landing. Winter, in her briefing, had already made the scale clear in human terms. The crew alone was equal to 25 times the population of Thyfera, a small nation living inside a single warship, all of them kept secret. In an unsettling detail, the reference book adds that the Lusankia actually required fewer crew than a standard Super Star Destroyer because it ran better computers. Those computers had been, in the book's own words, constantly receiving upgrades while hidden within Coruscant. Being buried had made the ship smarter. Palpatine never got to use it. The Emperor died over Endor in 4 ABY before the capital was ever attacked. The warship stayed on the ground, still waiting. The only person who knew where to find it was still alive. For 3 years, Izard kept the Lusankia safe as the Empire came apart. The Essential Guide to Warfare describes her rise during this time. By 5 ABY, with rival warlords fighting each other across the galaxy, she had become the real ruler of what was left of the New Order, with a permanent guard of Imperial Royal Guards. Meanwhile, the New Republic was closing in on Coruscant. In 7 ABY, with rebel forces inside the city, she did exactly what Palpatine had designed the ship to do. Wedge's Gamble lays out her preparation in her own words. She would move herself, she told her second-in-command Kirtan Lu, to her Lusankia facility, where she had the seeds of the rebellion's destruction that needed time to grow. Above ground, she left a sleeper terror network called the Palpatine Counterinsurgency Front. Below ground, she started the engines of the buried warship. The launch is described in order in the Krytos trap. Green turbo laser fire broke through the ferrocrete shell the ship had been sealed inside. The 6-sided repulsor lift cradle switched on, and the whole structure lifted free of the planet. Thrusters ignited, burning away even more of the cityscape above. More than 100 square kilometers of Coruscant's surface was erased in the launch itself, with millions of residents left missing and presumed dead. The warship broke through Coruscant's 2 planetary shields, traded fire briefly with an orbital Golan defense platform, jettisoned the 6-sided cradle that had held it underground, and jumped to hyperspace toward Thyfera, the back-to-producing planet whose medical monopoly would let Izard do exactly what Palpatine's blueprint prescribed: set up a new capital, seize a resource the galaxy could not live without, rule from a ship. Which means the one person who actually used the Lusankia the way Palpatine built it to be used was not Palpatine. It was the woman he had handed it to. She executed this plan in 7 ABY ABY. The only difference was that the capital she chose to relocate to was not hers to keep. Rogue Squadron ran her down at Thifera. Captain Joke Drizzo ordered the warship to ram Thifera rather than surrender, but the bridge command shifted to acting Captain Warowin before that could happen. Warowin surrendered the ship to the New Republic. Izard's revenge later shows Isan's own end. Years after the Bacta War, Izard resurfaced and attempted to seize the rebuilt Lusankia during a period of imperial political collapse. She boarded the warship, was cornered inside her own former quarters, and was shot dead by New Republic officer Yella Wasiri. The architect of the brainwashing program died inside the prison she had built. The ship her father's buried facility had inspired, the prison she had used to break others, the escape plan she had executed for a dead emperor. All of it ended with her body inside the same hull. The ship remained in New Republic hands for roughly 2 decades, passing through the refit, storage, and active service. The Legends comic series Crimson Empire, set 7 years after Endor, depicts the ongoing imperial collapse during this period, with surviving warlords fighting each other while the Lusankia begins its new life under rebel command. Later reference material, including the Essential Guide to Warfare, makes clear that other Executor-class vessels surfaced in imperial hands during this period, and the New Republic eventually refitted the Lusankia for combat because it could not rule out meeting other super heavy threats in the fragmented empire. Wedge Antilles eventually used the Lusankia himself at the Battle of Borleas in 28 ABY, in an operation he called Emperor's Hammer. He turned the ship's guns on a Yuuzhan Vong invasion force and unleashed the kind of single-handed orbital bombardment Palpatine had designed the warship to deliver. The narration in the novel Rebel Dream, written from the view of pilot Jaina Solo, caused the long arc in a single line. The Lusankia, the book states, was finally carrying out the purpose for which she had been built, before Jaina had even been born. The ship's story ended there. The pattern it belonged to did not. The Essential Guide to Warfare includes a passage worth remembering. The 4 super Star Destroyers the galaxy knew about publicly were the Executor, the Aggressor, the Brawl, and the Reaper. 4 ships, 4 flagships. Inside New Republic intelligence files, however, the true estimates ran much higher. More than 20, the source states, were thought to have been built. An exact count, in the tech's own words, proved nearly impossible to track for rebel investigators. Palpatine had ordered some of them built outside the records, kept in reserve at secret Imperial bases, sent into the unknown regions, or hidden for what the work calls the Emperor's own dark purposes. The Lusankia is named as the known example, the rest were never accounted for. The Lusankia was the one buried weapon the galaxy dug up. Of the more than 20 legends suggest were built, the others vanish into the records, and some may never have existed at all. A ruler who controlled the entire galaxy spent his reign hiding escape craft from his own apprentice, wiring cameras into his own spy agency, and parking a warship under his own capital in case any of it ever failed him, which is the question the ship leaves behind. The man who engineered the fall of the Republic, who survived 1,000 years of Sith planning, who ruled every world worth ruling, never stopped preparing to run. From what? The rebellion he was already grinding down, a successor he had personally chosen and broken, a galaxy that, by every visible measure, was already his. The buried warship answers in the only way a Sith Lord never says aloud. He did not believe in his own victory. The man who controlled everything spent his reign planning to escape from it because somewhere underneath the throne and the apprentice and the title, he expected the whole structure to come apart. The Lusankia was not a contingency for his enemies, it was a contingency for the day he stopped trusting his own grip on the galaxy he had already won. Palpatine buried a warship under his own capital in case he ever needed to disappear. He buried something else at the other end of the galaxy in case he ever needed to win. The planet that was building it had been kept off most of the galaxy's maps, and the army it produced would eventually destroy the Republic that paid for it. Chapter 1. The Hidden Planet. Kamino does not appear in the Jedi archives, not because the records are incomplete or the data is difficult to find, but because someone removed it. The star system exists, the gravitational data of the surrounding system confirms something massive should occupy that region of space, and yet, the Jedi Archives, the most comprehensive repository of knowledge in the galaxy, contain no entry for Kamino. When Obi-Wan Kenobi traces the saber dart from Attack of the Clones to its origin and arrives at this gap, Jocasta Nu concludes that if it does not appear in the archives, it does not exist. Obi-Wan's conclusion, which turns out to be correct, is that something was erased. The erasure traces back to Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, who had been warning the Jedi Council for years that a great conflict was coming and that the Republic would need a military force to survive it. The Council rejected his arguments, and Sifo-Dyas, acting without Council authority and without Senate knowledge or approval, contacted the Kaminoans and placed the order himself. Then, he was killed. Arranged by Darth Tyrannus, the Sith Lord the galaxy knew as Count Dooku, who stepped in to manage the project and inserted the inhibitor chip program into the cloning process before the first template scan was taken. The Republic had no idea the army being built in its name had been compromised at the source before a single clone was decanted. An army ordered by a dead man, managed by a Sith Lord, built on a planet no one was supposed to find. That is what the Republic sent its generals to command. The Kaminoans themselves tell the other half of the story. By the time Obi-Wan arrives for his inspection, Prime Minister Lama Su discusses the clone army with the flat professional pride of a manufacturer reviewing a production line. The growth acceleration, the behavioral conditioning, the combat training, the obedience enhancement, all of it presented as quality control rather than anything requiring moral examination. The Kaminoans built it with expertise and enthusiasm. What happened to the product after delivery was not, by their accounting, their concern. This army was compromised before it existed. The planet that built it never considered that a problem. Chapter 2. What they built. The Kaminoans called it a product. What they were actually building was a population of human beings with a kill switch none of them knew about. The template was Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter selected by Darth Tyrannus for reasons that went beyond simple competence. Jango was skilled, one of the most capable fighters of his era, but the selection was also ideological. The Mandalorian warrior tradition carried within it an entire cultural framework around combat, discipline, and the acceptance of death as an occupational condition. A template who embodied that framework would produce soldiers who arrived already oriented towards exactly the kind of life they were being designed to live. Growth acceleration pushed the clones to full physical maturity in a decade rather than 2. Not an unfortunate side effect, but a central feature of the specification. The Republic needed an army quickly, and the Kaminoans solved the inconvenience of standard human development timelines by engineering it away. With full knowledge that they were producing beings who would be old men in their 30s and dead before what the broader galaxy would consider late middle age. They knew. They built it that way anyway. In Legends, the Republic Commando series documents a training program run by the Kuival Dar, a group of 100 Mandalorian warriors recruited by Jango to instill warrior culture directly into the clones' upbringing. This was not just tactical training, but identity formation, giving the clones language, values, and a sense of belonging designed to make them excellent soldiers. What the Kaminoans had not fully accounted for was that this process also created the foundation for the individuality they would later spend considerable effort trying to contain. The inhibitor chip was the final layer, a biologically embedded device in every clone's brain, presented to the Jedi Order as a safeguard against clone aggression, documented in the Clone Wars Season 6. When activated by a specific command, it would override the clone's conscious will entirely, not degrade it, not redirect it, override it. The Kaminoans knew what it did. The Jedi were told something else entirely. This wasn't loyalty, it was design, and one piece of that design was never disclosed to the people who would be commanding it. Chapter 3. The Jedi Blind Spot. The Jedi Order accepted the clone army at Geonosis. That is the failure, not the absence of suspicion, not a deficit of intelligence, the acceptance itself, without the examination that acceptance required. Reservation existed. Mace Windu's discomfort is visible in Attack of the Clones. Yoda's line after the battle, that victory it was, but clouded the future remained, is not the statement of a leader who feels uncomplicated triumph. Several Jedi across the Clone Wars series express serious unease about their role as generals of an army they did not choose. But reservation is not refusal, and the Jedi's failure was not primarily one of suspicion, but of examination. They took the army because the alternative was watching the Separatists destroy the Republic and everyone they were sworn to protect. That was a real consideration, and it was not wrong. It was also exactly the kind of pressure the plan had been designed to create. The structural trap was this: a general who examines their troops as engineered products rather than soldiers cannot command those troops effectively. The Jedi who built genuine relationships with their clones, who knew their names, recognized their individual traits, trusted them across hundreds of engagements, were also the Jedi most exposed when Order 66 activated. Closeness that made the Jedi-clone partnership so effective in combat was the same closeness that made the betrayal so complete. The chip did not care about their relationship. When the command came, it performed its function regardless of what had been built before it. The specific moment that encapsulates this most precisely is the Fives arc in the Clone Wars Season 6. Fives discovers the inhibitor chip program, removes his own chip, and attempts to warn the Jedi Order. He gets close enough that Palpatine has to intervene personally, meeting with Fives alone, administering a drug to make his subsequent behavior erratic enough to be dismissed as paranoia, framing the truth as the delusion of a malfunctioning clone. Shaak Ti, who had more direct experience with the clones than almost any other Jedi, investigates and accepts the cover. The warning was real, and the system absorbed it. In Legends, the Republic Commando series adds an institutional layer. The clones existed in a legal gray area the Republic never formally resolved. No right to resign, no meaningful retirement, no legal standing outside their military function. The Jedi had the moral authority to challenge this arrangement. They never mounted a formal objection. The war was ongoing. The objection could wait. They cared about the clones. That is exactly why they failed. Caring about individuals is easier than questioning the system that produces them, and that gap between personal decency and institutional accountability was where the plan lived. Chapter 4. They became people. The Kaminoans built the clone army to produce reliable, interchangeable instruments. What they actually produced was a population of human beings, and that distinction is not incidental to the story. It is the mechanism that made Order 66 as catastrophic as it was. The individuality expressed itself in every way the conditioning had failed to engineer away. The clone designations were numerical, but the clones themselves used nicknames given to each other through shared experience. Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, Hardcase, Waxer, Boyle. None of them official, all of them the product of a human impulse towards identity that 3 years of accelerated training had narrowed but could not eliminate. Clone troopers collected things, formed preferences, grieved specific losses, maintained friendships across deployments and reassignments with the specificity of people who understood exactly how replaceable they were considered to be and refused to treat themselves that way. The Clone Wars series documents what this looked like in practice. Waxer memorized the name of a child on Ryloth and carried it. The 501st developed tactical opinions that diverged from standard doctrine and argued for them. Domino Squad failed their evaluation not because they lacked capability, but because they had not yet learned to function as a unit, which is to say, they were still learning the way people learn rather than performing as specified. The Kaminoans saw this and called it behavioral variance. The clones saw it and called it being alive. Every bond the clones formed made Order 66 more devastating, not less. Every Jedi who knew a clone by name, every clone who had served alongside a Jedi through 3 years of combat, every relationship built across hundreds of shared engagements, all of it became the specific content of the betrayal when the chip activated. The more human the clones became, the more complete the collapse of everything the Republic had built its war effort around. The Kaminoans had designed instruments. The instruments had become people, and Palpatine had designed Order 66 to use both facts simultaneously. The Bad Batch represent the outer limit of this logic. Clone Force 99, Hunter, Wrecker, Tech, Crosshair, and Echo were individuals whose combination of enhanced capabilities and distinct personalities made them extraordinarily effective in the field and impossible to treat as interchangeable. And Omega, the unmodified female clone who exists outside the weapon function entirely, is what results when you remove every military purpose from a Kaminoan creation and ask what remains. What remains is a person. The more human they became, the more catastrophic Order 66 would be. The system had been built to use that against them. Chapter 5. Built to betray. The Clone Wars did not lead to Order 66, they enabled it. The full architecture of how Palpatine engineered the clone army into the Republic's executioner requires holding several threads simultaneously. The commissioning through Sifo-Dyas and then Tyrannus was the foundation. The inhibitor chip, inserted into the cloning process before the first batch was decanted, was the mechanism. The sustained management of a galactic war that he was running from both sides simultaneously, as Supreme Chancellor directing the Republic and as Darth Sidious directing the Separatists, was the operational layer that kept the Jedi dependent on the clone army and prevented any pause long enough for real examination. The Fives arc in the Clone Wars Season 6 is the closest the timeline comes to documenting how this nearly unraveled. Tup, a trooper in the 501st, experiences a premature chip activation at Ringo Vinda and kills Jedi General Tiplar without a triggering order, and the anomaly draws attention. Fives refuses to accept the Kaminoan explanation, tumor, malfunction, defect, and begins his own investigation, removes his own chip, and discovers that the device is present in every clone and does exactly what it was designed to do. He gets to Palpatine, who meets with him alone and administers a drug that makes Fives' subsequent testimony erratic enough to be dismissed as chip malfunction. He is killed by a clone shock trooper before the examination can happen. What Fives found was true. What happened to that truth illustrates the precision of the preparation. The warning system had been neutralized by the same hand that had built the thing the warning was about. Rex's partial resistance in the Clone Wars Season 7 is the most specific documentation of what the chip actually did. Ahsoka removes his chip just after Order 66 activated. Rex, with his chip removed, is himself, the man who had spent years building genuine relationships with the Jedi he served. Rex, with his chip intact while the order was being given, would have continued to be something else entirely, a version of himself that retained every capability and operated completely outside his own will. In Legends, the mechanism is psychological conditioning rather than a biological implant, but the outcome in both continuities is the same. The kill switch was in place before the weapon was ever deployed. The war didn't lead to Order 66, it enabled it. 3 years of dependency, trust, and irreplaceable relationships, all of it leveraged for the moment Palpatine chose to use it. Chapter 6. The Night It Happened. Order 66 executed across the galaxy in a matter of hours. Revenge of the Sith documents the scale of it in a sequence that cuts between engagements with the brevity of a ledger. Ki-Adi-Mundi on Mygeeto, Isla Secura on Felucia, Plo Koon above Cato Neimoidia, Das Ali on Salukami. Each scene is seconds long. A few frames of Jedi dying, clones firing, and then the next. And the brevity is exactly the point. 3 years of partnerships, 3 years of combat alongside people who had trusted them with their lives, ended in moments without ceremony and without recognition of what was being destroyed. The handful who survived did so by specific accident rather than design. Obi-Wan fell into water a moment before Cody's shot could confirm the kill. Yoda's recognition to the Force gave him a fraction of a second's warning. Enough. Ahsoka, on the other hand, got lucky that Rex was strong enough to resist Order 66 for long enough to remove the chip, which meant the one closest to her was also the only clone in the operation who had a choice about what to do next. Kanan Jarrus was a Padawan whose master sacrificed herself to give him more time to run. In every case, the margin was specific, unrepeatable, and available to almost no one else in the galaxy that night. What the chip produced in clones who executed the order is visible most clearly in Rex. Rex, despite having the chip in him when Order 66 was activated, managed to resist attacking Ahsoka through sheer will long enough for her to remove his chip. He then immediately fought to protect her. Had they taken any longer, he likely would have killed her. The same man, the same memories, the same relationships, the same 3 years of earned loyalty, all of it rendered irrelevant by a device installed before he was born by a man he had never met. That is what the Kaminoans had placed in every clone in the army. Not a soldier who might turn, a soldier who would, when the moment came, turn completely. 3 years of the Republic's war effort ended in seconds. What it had been built on, the trust, the partnerships, the relationships the Jedi had formed with the people fighting beside them, turned out to be the thing that made the collapse so total. Chapter 7. The System That Failed. Every institution in the chain made choices that were, in isolation, defensible. The Kaminoans built what they were paid to build. The Senate accepted an army it had not commissioned because the alternative was watching the Separatists win. The Jedi took command because someone had to, and because the relationships they built with the clones were real and mattered, and were also, by design, exactly the vulnerability Palpatine needed. Each choice followed from the one before it. Each institution handed the problem to the next. None of them stopped. The Kaminoans are the clearest illustration of where that logic ends. They tracked behavioral variance in the clone population, euthanized those they considered defective, and presented the inhibitor chip to the Jedi as something it was not. Their professional pride in the quality of the product did not extend to examining the ethics of the product's existence. They defined their obligations by the terms of the contract, and the contract did not include a line about what the beings produced were owed when the war was over. In the Legends Republic Commando series, Jedi like Etain Turmukin and Arligan Zay did ask the questions about the clones' legal standing, their rights, what the Republic owed the people fighting its war. The institutional response was to manage their concerns rather than address them. The inquiry was routed around. The machine kept moving. The clones themselves are the only element of this history that comes out on the right side of it. Built to be instruments, they became people. Designed to be obedient, they developed judgment. Engineered to be temporary, they formed relationships that outlasted the war. The Republic, the Kaminoan production system, and in some cases, the Empire itself. The Bad Batch survived, Rex survived, Echo survived, Omega survived. The story does not end with Order 66. It continues in every clone who carried their humanity through a system designed to make humanity inconvenient and found, on the other side, that the system had not taken everything. Kamino itself was eventually destroyed by the Empire it had served, as documented in the Bad Batch. The planet that had survived its own near extinction by becoming the best in the galaxy at manufacturing expendable life was, in the end, treated as expendable. The Empire had what it needed, and the contract was concluded. The Republic commissioned its own end and called it protection. The clones built for that purpose refused, in every way available to them, to be only that. That distinction between what a system intends and what the people inside it become is the only thing in this history worth calling a victory. The galaxy remembers the Clone Wars as the Republic's final chapter, 3 years of conflict that ended with the Jedi destroyed, the Senate dissolved, and an empire rising from what remained. That account is inaccurate and incomplete, because it treats the clone army as backdrop rather than subject. The clones were not extras in the Republic's final chapter. They were the mechanism of it, built by a planet that treated life as a manufacturing problem, commissioned by a dead man whose warning had been ignored, weaponized by a Sith Lord who understood that the most reliable way to destroy an institution is to get that institution to build its own destroyer and trust it with everything. The outcome could have been different at multiple points if different choices had been made. What the history makes clear is what it cost to make the choices that were made, and what it cost the people who had no choices at all. The clones did not choose Order 66. The Republic did not choose to fall, but somewhere between those two facts is the truth about what happens when a civilization stops asking the questions that feel too expensive to answer. Kamino built the Betrayal. The planet that Betrayal landed on hardest was one of the few worlds that had actually trusted the clones. On Kashyyyk, the same soldiers who fought beside the Wookiees on the beaches became the first wave of an occupation that would last for over 2 decades. Kashyyyk won the battle. Republic clones and Wookiee warriors crushed the Separatist invasion on the beaches of Kashyyyk. Then Order 66 turned those same clones against their allies, and the victory became the beginning of a 24-year nightmare. The Empire enslaved the Wookiees, burned their forests, and stripped the planet of its name. After examining canon sources, this is what happened to Kashyyyk after the Republic fell. Chapter 1. The Betrayal. The final weeks of the Clone Wars brought the Separatist army to Kashyyyk. The Confederacy of Independent Systems launched a full-scale invasion of the Wookiee homeworld, targeting the coastal city of Kashyyyk and the hyperspace routes that the planet controlled. The Republic responded with force. Jedi Grand Master Yoda was deployed personally, sent because of his long-standing relationship with the Wookiees. Jedi Master Luminara Unduli commanded the 41st Elite Corps alongside Clone Commander Gree. On the ground, Wookiee Chieftain Tarful and the warrior Chewbacca rallied their people to defend the beaches. The combined Republic and Wookiee force held the line. Separatist battle droids advanced through the lagoon, supported by spider droids and armored vehicles. Wookiee warriors charged to meet them on the shoreline, while clone troopers provided fire from the beach and the tree platforms above. The defense was working. Kashyyyk was holding. Then, Palpatine transmitted Order 66. Across the galaxy, clone troopers turned on their Jedi commanders. On Kashyyyk, Yoda felt it before it reached him. He recoiled as the deaths of Jedi rippled through the Force, one after another, planet after planet. Commander Gree and a second clone trooper moved behind Yoda and raised their weapons. They never fired. Yoda sensed the betrayal, drew his lightsaber, and decapitated both clones in a single motion. Chewbacca and Tarful escorted Yoda through the jungle to a hidden escape pod. Yoda said his farewell. He told them goodbye and that he would miss them. Then he climbed into the pod, deactivated its distress beacon to avoid Imperial detection, and used his Jedi emergency transmitter to send a distress signal that reached Senator Bail Organa through Alderaanian contacts on Coruscant. The escape pod carried Yoda off Kashyyyk. He eventually reached Dagobah, where he would remain in exile for the next 2 decades. The clones who had fought beside the Wookiees now turned their weapons on them. The Wookiees had helped a Jedi escape. Under the new regime, that was enough. Luminara and Unduli did not die on the beaches of Kashyyyk. This is a common misconception, but canon tells a different story. Luminara survived Order 66 and was captured by Imperial forces. She was transported to the Spire, a maximum security prison on Stygian Prime, where the Grand Inquisitor executed her. The Empire preserved her remains and looped a holographic recording of her final moments in her cell, spreading false reports that she was still alive. The trap was designed to lure surviving Jedi into rescue attempts. Within a single day, the clones who had defended Kashyyyk became its occupiers, and the Jedi who had led them became ghosts. The Wookiees who had fought and bled to defend their world from the Separatists now stood alone against the very government they had trusted. The battle was over. What followed would strip Kashyyyk of its force, its people, and eventually its name. Chapter 2: Imperial Occupation. The Empire did not conquer Kashyyyk in a single battle. It consumed the planet in stages, each one more systematic than the last. The first stage was military. The clone troopers who had fought beside the Wookiees became the planet's first occupying force overnight. The same soldiers who had taken orders from Jedi generals now answered to Palpatine's new empire, and their first directive was total control of the Wookiee population. Civilian travel was restricted immediately, with access to the planet granted only for official government business. When an organized Wookiee revolt broke out, the 212th Attack Battalion crushed it before it could spread. Any Wookiee who had aided a Jedi was now classified as an enemy of the state, and the clones who had once called them allies were the ones enforcing that classification. The second stage was outsourcing the violence. The Empire turned to the Trandosians, a reptilian species whose homeworld Trandosia occupied the same star system as Kashyyyk. Trandosian slavers had conducted raids on Wookiee villages for generations, long before the Empire existed. Now the Empire gave them official backing, military-grade equipment, and legal authority to operate openly. In The Bad Batch Season 2, set just months after Order 66, Trandosian mercenaries arrived on Kashyyyk equipped with Imperial-supplied incinerator tanks, repurposed Separatist-era vehicles fitted with flamethrowers. Clone stormtroopers provided military oversight, while Trandosian crews carried out the destruction village by village. Settlements were burned to the ground. Carved stones, markers of Wookiee cultural heritage, were reduced to rubble. Wookiees were dragged from their homes, separated from their families, and loaded onto transports. The third stage was bureaucratic, and it cut deeper than any weapon. The Empire repealed the Republic-era laws that had prohibited the enslavement of sentient species, then reclassified the Wookiees themselves as non-sentient. That single administrative designation stripped them of every legal protection the Republic had once guaranteed. Their culture, language, and rights ceased to exist under Imperial law. In the eyes of the Empire, the Wookiees held no more legal standing than the wildlife in the forests around them. And then, the Empire erased the planet itself. Kashyyyk was removed from official Imperial records and redesignated Imperial Territory G5623. A world whose civilization stretched back thousands of generations was reduced to a filing code. The fourth stage was governance. Grand Moff Lozen Tulruk was installed as planetary governor, ruling from an island fortress off the Kashyyyk coast. he deployed assassin probes into the forest to track and kill Wookiees for sport. Commandant Theoden Sardo operated Camp Sardo, a forced labor installation near the Wookiee city of Arathaka, and formally proposed farming the Wookiee population for meat. Tulruk endorsed the proposal. Star Destroyers maintained a permanent blockade from orbit, while forest troopers and Imperial garrisons enforced the occupation on the ground. Wookiees who resisted were killed or shipped off-world to labor camps. Those who complied were enslaved where they stood. By 14 years after the fall of the Republic, a massive Imperial refinery operated on Kashyyyk's surface, guarded by stormtroopers, KX series security droids, purge troopers, and flame troopers. Enslaved Wookiees worked inside under conditions designed for maximum output and zero regard for their survival. The refinery was not an isolated facility, it was the visible machinery of a system that had been grinding for over a decade, and the conditions inside would reveal the full scope of what the Empire had built on the backs of the Wookiee people. Chapter 3: The Slave World. The Empire did not simply occupy Kashyyyk, it harvested it. The Wookiees became raw material, and their sacred forest became fuel. Inside the Imperial refinery, and across the labor camps that spread through the occupied territories, the true nature of the occupation revealed itself. This was not military control, this was industrial extraction of a species. Every enslaved Wookiee on Kashyyyk had an inhibitor chip bolted to the back of their skull. When activated, the chip delivered excruciating pain that could drop even the strongest Wookiee to the ground. Tulruk quickly realized that threatening individual Wookiees meant nothing because they would fight to the death without hesitation. Instead, he threatened their families. When one resisted, Imperial officers activated the chips implanted in their children, elders, and partners. The pain became the leash. On top of the chips, enslaved workers wore electronic slave collars and were chained together in labor groups with no privacy and no rest beyond what the shift schedule permitted. They worked covered in mud and dangerous industrial byproducts in facilities designed only with yield in mind, with no thought given to the comfort or safety of the people inside. Wookiees died regularly from toxic poisoning, one of the many side effects of the refining process that the Empire considered an acceptable cost of production. Wookiees were also bred for use in medical experimentation under the occupation. The Empire shipped Wookiees far beyond Kashyyyk to work on its most critical projects. Wookiee forced labor built both Death Stars. In Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Treason, Imperial logistics records identify Blosfy extract shipments as food supplies designated for Wookiee slaves working on Project Stardust, the Empire's internal designation for the first Death Star. Wookiees were also transported in massive numbers to the spice mines of Kessel, one of the most brutal labor operations in the galaxy. In Star Wars Rebels: Spark of Rebellion, Wookiee prisoners, including the warrior, Wolf Warrow, and his young son Kitwar, were being shipped to Spice Mine K-76 before the crew of the Ghost intercepted the transport and freed them. Kitwar was a child. His presence confirmed what the Empire's own records deliberately obscured. It enslaved Wookiee children alongside adults without hesitation and without distinction. In Solo: A Star Wars Story, set 9 years earlier, Wookiee slaves, including a warrior named Sagwa, were shown working in Pike's Syndicate-operated mines on Kessel. Chewbacca, himself an Imperial prisoner, helped free them during a chaotic raid on the facility. Chewbacca's own path through the occupation was one of its countless individual tragedies. Han Solo first encountered him not on Kashyyyk, but on Mimban, a war-torn mud world where the Empire kept Chewbacca in a pit beneath a military outpost. They called him the Beast. When Han was thrown into the same pit as punishment for desertion, he was expected to die. Instead, he spoke to Chewbacca and convinced him to cooperate rather than kill. They fought their way out together, escaped Mimban, and never separated again. The most famous partnership in the galaxy began in a mud pit. It began because one human being looked at a Wookiee the Empire had classified as an animal and saw a person. The destruction the Empire inflicted on Kashyyyk extended far beyond its people. The planet itself was being consumed. In The Bad Batch Season 2, set just months after the Empire's founding, the clone Tech discovered large swaths of smog and deforestation on approach to Kashyyyk from orbit. Trandoshan mercenaries with incinerator tanks were already stripping entire regions of forest cover. By the time of the liberation in 5 ABY, entire sections of ancient Roshir forests had been clear-cut for lumber and processing, and several major rivers had been drained to feed refinery cooling systems. At the center of the devastation was Project Siphon, an Imperial program that harvested Roshir tree sap and refined it into a volatile chemical compound. The databank in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order confirmed the scale. For every barrel of sap refined, over 200 tons of industrial waste were pumped directly into nearby waterways. The Roshir trees were not simply lumber to the Empire, they were chemical feedstock to be processed and shipped until nothing remained. But to the Wookiees, the Roshir trees were far more than a resource. They were sacred. Wookiees commune with the trees before making important decisions and prayed at their roots. They believed the forest itself was alive, with a guiding presence that had protected their civilization since its earliest days. In The Bad Batch, the Wookiee elder Yana explained this bond to outsiders for the first time. The Wookiees believed the trees were their allies, that Kashyyyk belonged to the forest as much as the forest belonged to them. Every tree the Empire burned or drained severed another thread of the connection between the Wookiees and the living world they had inhabited for thousands of generations. The Trandoshans who burned the carved stones and razed entire villages, including the settlement where the young Wookiee Jedi Padawan Gungi had once lived, were not just destroying structures, they were destroying identity itself. The Empire stripped the Wookiees of their names, their trees, their children, and their freedom, but it could not strip what the Wookiees carried inside themselves. And deep in the forest the Empire could not reach, the Resistance was already growing. Chapter 4: Resistance and Survival. The Empire controlled the beaches, the cities, and the skies above Kashyyyk. It did not control the Shadowlands. The Shadowlands were the lowest and most dangerous region of Kashyyyk's forest, a place of permanent darkness filled with predators that Imperial patrols refused to enter. For the Wookiees who chose to resist the occupation, this made the deep forest the one place on the planet where the Empire could not follow. The earliest organized resistance emerged within months of Order 66. In The Bad Batch Season 2, a Wookiee tribe led by the Elder Yana had been driven from their original settlement after Trandoshan mercenaries burned it to the ground. Rather than surrender, Yana led her people deeper into the forest and established a hidden village beneath the canopy where Imperial scanners could not reach them. The tribe used their knowledge of Kashyyyk's native wildlife as a tactical advantage, deliberately luring enemy patrols into the nesting grounds of netcaster arachnids, massive predatory spiders. The forest itself became a weapon, and the Wookiees were the only ones who knew how to use it. Yana's tribe received an unexpected reinforcement. The young Wookiee Jedi Padawan Gungi, who had survived Order 66, found his way back to Kashyyyk. The Bad Batch, the clone commando unit known as Clone Force 99, delivered Gungi to the planet after recovering him from Imperial custody. Yana accepted him into the tribe, and Gungi ignited his blade against the Trandoshans who threatened his people. His return represented something the Empire had tried to destroy entirely, a Wookiee who carried the legacy of the Jedi Order back to the world that needed it most. By 14 years after the fall of the Republic, the Resistance had produced a leader the Empire could not capture. Chieftain Tarful, the same Wookiee warrior who had helped Yoda escape during Order 66, had become the most elusive Resistance leader on the planet. Tarful operated from deep within the Shadowlands, launching guerrilla strikes against Imperial installations and vanishing back into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. The rebel leader Saw Gerrera, who brought his partisan fighters to Kashyyyk to disrupt Imperial supply lines, called Tarful the Freedom Fighter, a symbol of the Wookiee resistance who struck at the Empire from the one place it could not reach. The Empire had mapped the coastlines and the canopy cities, but it had never mapped the Shadowlands, and Tarful used that ignorance to survive for over a decade. Saw Gerrera's partisans brought the first significant outside military support to the Resistance. When the young Jedi Padawan Cal Kestis arrived on Kashyyyk searching for Tarful, he joined the fight, hijacking an Imperial AT-AT and turning it against the occupation forces before raiding the Imperial refinery alongside Saw's fighters to free the Wookiee prisoners held inside. But the victory was temporary. Imperial reinforcements overwhelmed the partisans, and Saw withdrew from the planet entirely. A fighter named Mari Kozan refused to leave, one of the earliest fractures in Saw's movement. With the partisans gone, Cal returned to Kashyyyk a second time after Tarful was finally located in the Shadowlands. The chieftain directed him to the Origin Tree, an ancient roaster of immense size that the Wookiees considered sacred. Cal ascended the tree, defeated an Imperial Inquisitor at its summit, and recovered the information he sought. The Origin Tree had sheltered both the knowledge and the Jedi who came to find it. The resistance on Kashyyyk was not limited to the planet itself. Chewbacca became the most visible Wookiee in the rebellion through his partnership with Han Solo, but he was not alone. A Wookiee ship captain named Logara, who remembered occupied Kashyyyk as a paradise turned to hell, joined the Rebel Alliance and fought at the Battle of Endor. Other Wookiees traveled to Lasan when the Empire devastated the Lasat homeworld, giving their own lives to defend a species that was not their own, fighting with weapons forged from Rocher wood. Despite 2 decades of occupation, Kashyyyk was designated a Rebel Alliance safe world on Rebel navigation charts. The Empire had taken the planet, it had not taken the fight out of its people. For 20 years, the Wookiees fought from the shadows while the galaxy looked away. It took the fall of an emperor before anyone came to help. Chapter 5. Long-term consequences. The liberation of Kashyyyk was not a battle planned by generals or authorized by senators. It was a debt repaid by a smuggler, a Wookiee, and a handful of people who decided that the galaxy's politics could wait. The New Republic had defeated the Emperor at Endor, but 1 year later, Kashyyyk was still enslaved. Han Solo and Chewbacca, acting independently after Han resigned his New Republic military commission, learned of a narrow window to infiltrate Kashyyyk when the Imperial blockade temporarily shifted its patrol routes. Han assembled a small strike team and launched the mission. The intelligence was a trap. Imperial Star Destroyers ambushed the convoy before it reached the surface. Han escaped. Chewbacca did not. He was captured and imprisoned in Ashmead's Lock, an automated detention facility built from the wreckage of a crashed prison ship buried deep in Kashyyyk's jungles. The Wookiee who had helped free Yoda from this planet 2 decades earlier was now a prisoner on it. Han searched the Outer Rim for his partner, while Princess Leia Organa fought a different battle entirely. She lobbied the New Republic leadership to authorize a military operation to liberate Kashyyyk, bringing the case to Admiral Akbar and Chancellor Mon Mothma personally. They refused. Mon Mothma ordered no official military incursions into Imperial-held territory during ongoing peace negotiations. Leia refused to accept that answer. She turned to Nora Wexley, a veteran rebel pilot, and her team of operatives, who found Han alive and launched their own mission to break Chewbacca out of Ashmead's Lock. The team infiltrated Kashyyyk aboard the Millennium Falcon and reached the prison. They fought their way inside, disabled the facility's automated defenses, and freed Chewbacca along with dozens of other prisoners. On his home world, the dynamic between Han and Chewbacca reversed completely. Chewbacca took tactical command, navigating terrain he knew by instinct, and making decisions that would determine the fate of his people. Together, they destroyed the Imperial Deflector shield generator at Camp Sardo near Arataka, opening a critical gap in the occupation's defensive network. But the true turning point came from inside the enemy's own fortress. Sinjir Rath Velis, a former Imperial loyalty officer who had defected to the New Republic, infiltrated Grand Moff Talaric's island compound. He was discovered and captured almost immediately, but before they took him, Sinjir had smuggled a hyperwave transceiver spike inside the heel of his boot. From his cell, he activated the device. It hacked directly into Talaric's planetary control module and transmitted a single command that disabled every inhibitor chip on every enslaved Wookiee on Kashyyyk simultaneously. Across the planet, the pain stopped. Wookiees who had spent years unable to resist without condemning their families to agony suddenly realized they were free to fight. The uprising was instantaneous, planet-wide, and unstoppable. Enslaved Wookiees overpowered their captors in labor camps, refineries, cities, and military installations across every continent. 24 years of suppressed rage broke the surface in a single hour. Grand Moff Talaric, watching his empire collapse from his fortress, made his final decision. He ordered his 3 Star Destroyers to commence orbital bombardment of Kashyyyk, willing to incinerate the entire surface rather than lose control. His words to Rear Admiral Orlan were simple. The terrorists had won. The inhibitors were down. The animals were escaping the zoo, and he wanted it all burned to cinder. He never saw the order carried out. His former Wookiee slave, known only by the Imperial designation Cracktooth, reached him before anyone else could. She broke his neck in his own throne room. Above the planet, Princess Leia arrived aboard the Millennium Falcon. Captain Wedge Antilles and his newly formed Phantom Squadron, 12 X-Wings operating without Senate authorization, launched an attack on the blockade. And Han Solo, who had been captured aboard the Star Destroyer Dominion during the ground fighting, hijacked the warship from within. He turned its turbo lasers on the Vitiator and split it in half. The third destroyer, the Neutralizer, surrendered. The blockade was broken. Kashyyyk was free. It was 5 ABY, and the occupation that had lasted 24 years was finally over. When the fighting ended, Chewbacca found his son. Lumpawaru had been held in Commandant Desard's child labor camp on the slopes of Mount Arayakak, the same mountain whose orchards the Empire had poisoned with black mold. Chewbacca led armed Wookiees and New Republic soldiers to the camp, liberated the children inside, and captured Desard. Han Solo, standing beside his partner on the surface of a world that was finally free, told Chewbacca to stay. His family needed him. His planet needed him. The life debt between them was fulfilled. Han returned to Leia. Chewbacca stayed on Kashyyyk. The Roshir forest slowly regrew and the rivers began to recover, but the scars remained in the wood. They would always remain in the wood. 24 years of enslavement, sacred trees burned, children taken, and a civilization nearly erased. And when freedom finally came, it arrived not from the institutions that would have protected the Wookiees, but from the individuals who refused to look away. Kashyyyk survived because its people survived. The Roshir trees grew back, but they grew back scarred. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video you might like.